Hey guys, hope you are well. So, welcome to the Anime Fictions 2.0. This is the story about What If Dichotomy of Namikaze Naruto. Part 3. Hope you loved previous parts. You will love this What If. If you did, do subscribe for more awesome What If. Share with your friends and enjoy them. Check out the other videos I have created. Comment down your opinion. Share with your friends. So, without wasting any time, the wind rustled the sakura petals as the now shirtless Naruto approached her with lust in his eyes. His body glistened with sweat and his scent screamed an untamed lust that made her knees quiver with anticipation. "Hinata. I want you. I need you. Right now." He pushed her to the ground forcefully and gazed into her eyes, unspoken words passing between them in the space of seconds. She smiled back at him and undid her obi, revealing herself to be completely nude for him underneath. She blushed under his hungry stare. "I know, Naruto-kun. I came prepared. I am yours and only yours. Tonight. And forever." She arched her back, giving him an unobstructed view of her assets, and he plunged into her mouth with a ferocious kiss, his hands reaching down to Hinata. Hinata shot awake at hearing her name so forcefully called and began to take in her surroundings as her ninja training kicked in. She was in her family's private dining chamber, surrounded by her father, her sister, and blood rushed to her cheeks and elsewhere. At seeing Naruto's face so close to her own, images of her delusional dream came flooding back into her mind. And her face, if possible, became redder than it had been before. Naruto breathed a sigh of relief and rocked back on his haunches as her father carefully rose her to a kneeling sitting position on the soft kneeling mat. Hanabi was carefully giggling at her sister's predicament while Hiashi had a pensively concerned look on his face as his own thoughts churned rather tumultuously. Why had Hinata reacted so forcefully to Naruto's presence? Moreover, why did she have an almost perpetual blush and why did she throw continuous furtive glances at Naruto before she violently righted her eyes back to her downward gaze? Hiashi racked his brain trying to find the proper explanation for such behavior. Naruto on the other hand was only partially oblivious. His experiences over the past few days regarding the glances of the female population of Konoha as well as Tenten's assertion that he was hot had given him a slight insight into the mind of a female that he was now using to explain Hinata's lapse of consciousness. She had fainted when he entered the room, not before. She had visibly tensed and she had blushed so hard that Naruto had thought her a strawberry. Over and above that, she had muttered Naruto-kun a few times in her semi-comatose state, although no one had heard it other than him apparently. She had almost refused to look at him after she came to, and her blush, if anything, had only deepened since her reawakening. All signs led to one conclusion. Hinata was a pervert. There was no other logical explanation in Naruto's head. He had seen various forms of perversion in his relatively short life. Especially during his researching sessions for the sexy no jutsu. And when someone blushed and fainted when looking at someone, it was because they were thinking all too perverted thoughts about that person. He unconsciously filed that tidbit of data away in his do not open until puberty folder and decided that despite her perversion, she was still a good person. Hinata, are you okay now? He decided that Hiashi didn't necessarily need to know that his daughter was a pervert. Hinata just blushed and nodded her head faintly, still refusing to look up from the ground. Hiashi and Hanabi, by this time, had gone back to their own positions, although they were both shooting confused and in Hanabi's case, amused glances in her direction. Hiashi was the first to regain a semblance of his regal composure. "Seeing as how Hinata is feeling better, I believe we can resume." It was voiced as a question, but Naruto was sure that it didn't really matter what he cared. True to what Naruto thought, without even a second passing, Hiashi nodded to an unseen servant waiting just outside the door and nothing short of a small feast was carted into their dining area. He was floored by the raw amount of food that was brought in. For a 4-person dinner affair, the food that was served to them was probably enough to satiate a party of 10 and not leave any room for dessert. Naruto sent an almost amazed and somewhat disbelieving glance in Hiashi's direction, but if the man recognized it, he didn't seem to show it outwardly. On the inside however, Hiashi was positively beaming. He was already making a good impression on the boy and if the night continued as he hoped, all parties would have exactly what they needed by the end. Hiashi almost smirked. He hoped Minato was thanking him for this. After the servants got done carting in the food, they all voiced a polite and dignified itadakimasu before they all dug in. Or rather, Naruto dug in. The 3 Hyuga that were part of the meal were nobles and as such, had a more regal and dainty way of eating that involved complex utensils and formality. Naruto knew of no such thing and even if he had, it's doubtful he would have cared. He was simply piling food onto his plate at an accelerated rate and once his plate couldn't hold much more, he began his impromptu feast in earnest. Hinata was slightly more reserved and her thoughts were going a mile a minute. Why on earth would her father invite Naruto over for a family dinner, a formal one at that? Moreover, if Naruto had been the one to cause Hiyashi's sudden and terrifying mood change, what about him would warrant such a thing? Hinata prided herself on being the foremost knowledgeable expert on all things Naruto. She had all but stalked the boy for years. She knew his likes, his dislikes, his weaknesses, his dream, what time he normally woke up, what time he normally went to bed. She knew a plethora of information on Naruto that no one else knew, and now, all of this was effectively rendered null by the fact that he was now, somehow, nobility. This revelation was due to the fact that Hiyashi very rarely invited someone for a family dinner unless they were one of two things, a ninja in high standing within the village, or nobility of some sort. Unless the person in question met those criteria, they were considered all but worthless to the Hyuga head, and seeing as how Naruto was only barely a genin, he had to be nobility for her father to even consider him for such an honor. Even if Naruto, somehow, wasn't nobility, he would be after this. If Hiyashi acknowledged someone like this, then, by default, they became as such. He usually would acknowledge people by simply word of mouth or by extending an invitation for the person to attend a semi-private party. Never before had her father invited someone to such a private and esteemed event as a family dinner to simply acknowledge them. If Naruto somehow wasn't nobility, then this was simply stunning. And unprecedented. And it would be all over the village by the next day. And she would have rivals. Hinata nearly fainted again at the thought. The whole reason that Uchiha Sasuke was such a heartthrob among the village's female population was due to three basic factors. 1. He was an Uchiha. Nobility of the highest order, second only to the Hyuga. Or at least, they were. Secondly, he was obviously a pretty boy, as far as the definition went. Even Hinata would admit that much. Thirdly, Sasuke was a tragic figure, shrouded in mystery and pain. And such a thing only heightened interest in him. After this, Naruto would fit at least two. Maybe even all three of those criteria. He would be acknowledged in the highest way by the head of the Hyuga clan. He was undeniably good-looking, especially with his somehow transformed visage and unexplained growth spurt. And he was a mystery to almost everyone. This mystery would be heightened even further by the fact that he would have been acknowledged by her father. And no one would know why. Naruto would have a fan club. Probably one that rivaled Sasuke's in size. The boy would be beating them off with a stick. She would no longer be the lone girl in the shadows, watching her prince and waiting for the right moment. She would simply be another fangirl, and one without the benefit of being brash and look at me. Hinata, if possible, paled to a shade of white that no Hyuga had ever before paled to. She would lose her chance. And again, there was the possibility that she was overreacting horribly. Naruto, for reasons that she still didn't know, was ignored. Disliked. Hated by the greater majority of the village. Those few that did accept him were few and far between, even if they were some of the most powerful people in the village. In fact, Hinata had noticed that the greater majority of the ninja population of Konoha respected the boy almost without exception. The civilian population, on the other hand, detested him. She had tried for years to figure out why, and she never could. This led to the very reason why she loved the boy so fervently. He was everything that she was not. He had braved horrible adversity in his life and had taken it all with a smile and a brash uncaring attitude that had all but shouted confidence in himself. Even after everything that he had endured, he had come out on top. Or bottom as it were. He simply hadn't let any of it get to him. Hinata had faced adversity as well. Or at least, she liked to think she had. Her father had been cold and uncaring towards her since her mother's death, and her family viewed her with thinly veiled contempt due to the fact that by Hyuga standards, she was weak. Her utilization of the Hyuga's signature Gyuukin style was subpar as compared to even her younger sister, and her demeanor was certainly not what a typical Hyuga sported. She was quiet, demure, kind. According to her family, a Hyuga was supposed to be superior and strong and mean most of the time. It was supposedly to strike fear into your enemies' hearts or some such thing. What made this all worse was the fact that she was the heir to the entire Hyuga clan. While other children in the clan had the ability to be at least somewhat outside the norm of regular Hyuga conduct, she was expected to be the very picture of it. That she was almost the exact opposite did not help. Instead of being interested in Gyuukin, she was interested in medical techniques, salves, and creams. Instead of striking fear into her enemies' hearts, she was ridiculed almost constantly, and it had become a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. They said she was weak, which destroyed her self-confidence, which in turn made her weaker. She had let it get to her. That was the difference. Instead of persevering and coming out on the other side with a smile, she had been pushed under. She was a broken little girl who needed a self-confidence boost. And she found such a thing in Naruto almost exclusively. Whenever she saw him, she would immediately become shy, but she could also feel a confidence that she wouldn't feel at any other time. The boy was, for all intents and purposes, her entire reason for how strong she was. Even if it wasn't that strong. She didn't even want to imagine how weak she would be without a figure like Naruto to idolize. What made her even more self-depreciatingly morose was the fact that this was the absolute perfect opportunity in which to confess her feelings for the boy. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Obviously, her father liked the boy, so that was no longer an issue. It didn't much matter that Hanabi was here, as she was still in her boy's Uriki phase, at least to a certain extent. And Naruto was obviously in a good mood. The situation couldn't be more perfect if she had written it in some sort of fictional piece of writing. It was perfect. The thought almost made her lose all hope of gaining Naruto's admiration, respect, or, dare she think it, love. It was her dream at night and her thought at waking. It was her goal while awake. Her entire existence revolved, at least in some way, around Naruto. It was almost sad. And yet, she wouldn't have it any other way. Then why? Why was she hesitating? Why was she simply sitting here like an idiot, poking at her food and staring at the floor, when she could be shouting at Naruto about her love and admiration for him? Tears threatened to well up in her eyes, but she pushed them back forcefully. Her father. Her sister. Naruto would not see her cry. Ieyashi, at that moment, had an epiphany. He recognized exactly where he had recognized those stares, glances and blushes before. It was painfully obvious. But it hadn't registered until he had finally admitted to himself that Hinata was almost exactly like her mother in personality. Hinata's mother had done the exact same thing while she was trying to court him. Ieyashi could just barely restrain the smile that threatened to break out on his face. This situation. It couldn't be more perfect. One of his problems was almost instantaneously solved. Naruto. If I may ask. He paused to allow the boy to clear his mouth before Naruto turned towards him with a semblance of a formal facade. What do you think of my daughter, Hinata? Ieyashi saw Naruto's eyes widen only slightly before they once again returned to match his impassive visage. Hinata on the other hand wasn't so lucky. She choked on a piece of food that she had been chewing and only barely managed to get it down before she sputtered incoherently towards her father. Father? Naruto-kun. You. Hinata didn't seem to be able to form a cogent thought, much less a coherent sentence at that point. Ieyashi was almost surprised that she was still conscious. Naruto on the other hand dealt with it much more easily. I know that she's a kind and caring person. But, to be honest Ieyashi-san, I don't know her all that well. He said the last part sheepishly as though apologizing for not getting to know Hinata when he obviously had no real need to. Up until now. Ieyashi just smiled ever so slightly, which scared Hanabi and even Hinata to no end. Well, Naruto. How would you like to get to know her better? He phrased his words carefully so as not to imply anything and yet say everything. Naruto seemed to be shrewder than he let on. As a friend, or are you angling for something? Naruto by now had a slightly serious look on his face and Ieyashi, even though he was peeved, had to give the boy some credit. He had picked up on it rather well. Damn. Oh, of course, as a friend. I would never dream to make any decisions of that nature for Hinata without her explicit agreement. Ieyashi said it with as much indignation as possible, but if Naruto was swayed by it, he certainly didn't show it. Ieyashi was more than mildly impressed. Naruto sat there for a moment before an only slight smile graced his face. Iyashi's own smile fell off his face. He didn't like that smile. He really didn't like that smile. I would love to get to know Hinata, Ieyashi-san. However, it is completely up to her if she wants to get to know me. You know of my condition. Her reputation and your own would suffer for having me involved with you, wouldn't it? He had said it all with as much of a straight face as possible, but there was an almost imperceptible smile on his face as he said it. Hinata and Hanabi both looked at Naruto and Ieyashi with a curious and confused visage, but both kept silent. They knew better than to ask questions during one of their father's diplomacy sessions. And even though Hinata was absolutely voracious to learn what exactly he was referring to, she used every bit of willpower she had to force herself to remain a statue. Ieyashi suppressed a curse. He hadn't expected Naruto to play the Kyuubi card so early. He certainly should have. It was the greatest trump card anyone in the village had, bar none. He forced his mind to churn up a response, and he almost smiled. If he wanted to play that game, Ieyashi would play. Oh, I know of your condition rather well, Naruto. If I was that concerned about my reputation, I wouldn't have invited you over here. Besides. Wouldn't her and my reputation be all the more prolific if we were associated with your father? Ieyashi had to suppress a downright grin at seeing Naruto's face of panic. If the Kyuubi was a trump card, knowledge of his ancestry was an ace. If possible, Hinata and Hanabi both peaked even more. This was becoming almost too much to bear, and it took every last possible shred of willpower that Hinata possessed not to blurt out her obvious questions in the middle of her father's diplomatic pursuits. Naruto took a few moments to compose himself before he turned his now completely serious gaze on Hiashi. Hiashi schooled himself as well. They were playing for keeps now. Perhaps. But you know as well as I do that that knowledge cannot be made public, Hiashi-san. Naruto emphasized the san rather forcefully, letting Hiashi know just how close he was treading to dangerous territory. Hiashi once again suppressed a grin. The boy had fallen for it. Oh, I wouldn't dream of making such information public. Yet. However, I believe your reputation would be strengthened should you become powerful enough to allow that information to be made public. Your reputation would only be increased if you happened to be tied to the Hyuga at the time. He let the implication that he too would gain clout unvoiced, even though it was painfully obvious. Naruto almost cursed. Hiashi was trying to maneuver him into some sort of relationship with Hinata against her wishes. He simply decided that while diplomacy wasn't his forte, bluntness certainly wasn't Hiyashi's. I'm not going into any kind of arranged anything with Hinata against her wishes. Period. Naruto almost cringed when Hiashi positively grinned. Hanabi literally curled up into herself and if possible, Hinata paled even further. Hiashi was absolutely beside himself. Naruto had played right into his hand. Against her wishes. I assure you Naruto, such a thing is very much her greatest wish. Am I not correct, Hinata? Hiashi swallowed a lump in his throat. If Hinata was indecisive now. He nearly cursed. If this relied on Hinata to be decisive, he had just made a grievous tactical error. To absolutely everyone's surprise, Hinata didn't stutter, nor did she pass out. In fact, she didn't say anything. Her head was nodding furiously, and her eyes were as wide as saucers. Hiashi could nearly hug the girl, if it wasn't improper. The expressions that Hiashi found on Naruto's face, however, were priceless. He went from surprised to doubtful, and then back to surprised, and then something that Hiashi couldn't readily identify. Something between guarded hope and veiled enlightenment. From years of diplomacy, Hiashi was good at picking out what facial expressions meant. Hiashi did feel a little guilty. He was playing to the boy's weaknesses and his need for friendship. But this was something that needed to be done. If he could get Naruto and Hinata together. He almost smiled at the possibilities. It would be good for both the Hyuga and the namikaze. Or at least, the last namikaze left. Naruto's own thoughts were thrown into chaos the second that Hinata actually nodded her consent to Hiashi's insane. Or he thought insane. Ramblings. He had been under the impression that Hinata would not want something like this and truthfully, he didn't want the girl to be saddled with anything to do with him. She looked like she was under enough pressure as it was and being a friend of his was something that would certainly put even more pressure on her. He wouldn't even entertain the thought that he would take some sort of arranged marriage or something. He would be her friend. If it developed into something more, so be it. Besides, this was becoming all too complicated. Hiashi-san. If Hinata agrees to it, then I agree to it. However. He looked at Hiashi with his best impression of a piercing gaze. He didn't know just how effective it was. Hiashi noticed the small amount of kai that Naruto was producing through his stare and almost shivered. It wasn't any normal kai. The boy had access to the kai of the Kyuubi, that much was sure. Your definition of it and my definition thereof differ. Hiashi simply looked at him confused, but he had an idea of where this was going. Naruto just sighed and glanced at Hinata out of the corner of his eye. He noticed that the girl was again finding something terribly interesting about the floor. He nearly cringed. The girl had the self-confidence of a gnat. His first duty as her friend would be to get rid of that particular weakness. I agree to be her friend, no more. Hell, I would have agreed to that without all of this verbal meandering we seem to do. Whether it progresses past that, as per your intentions. He let that hang for a moment watching Hiashi's eyebrow twitch just once. Is a matter that is decided between me and Hinata. And with all due respect. We're 12. Naruto noted the at least agreeable face that Hiashi had and noticed with a cocked eyebrow that Hinata seemed to be happier than she had been a second ago. Naruto was beginning to get the picture of what exactly was going on here. Naruto sighed. Hinata. Do you have a crush on me? Naruto was just now sifting through his mental archives of the few memories he had of the girl and realized that he simply couldn't have recognized it earlier. It wasn't for lack of the girl trying. It had more to do with the fact that he simply had no concept of someone actually liking him as opposed to either ignoring him or hating his guts. He hadn't been able to readily identify just what was going on without a nudge from an outside source. In this case, her father. Hinata's eyes widened once more and after a few moments, she gave an almost imperceptible nod. Naruto just smiled slightly. He supposed that it was nice to know that someone actually liked him. Hinata on the other hand was an emotional wreck. She had been just about ready to give up on her quest for Naruto and truthfully, give up on being a ninja. And then from the most unlikely source of them all, her father, she had gone from that particular depressed state to now being Naruto's newest friend. And she wasn't sure if she should be ecstatic about it or if she was sad that Naruto had to be forced into it. Her mind apparently wasn't hers to make up. Heh, sorry about not noticing sooner. I guess I'm not the most socially perceptive person around, eh? He scratched the back of his neck in typical Naruto fashion and he gave Hinata his patented foxy grin. Hinata promptly forgot her troubles. Because she fainted. Naruto slid the door open and walked out of the room as Hanabi and a random servant were doting over Hinata's unconscious and furiously blushing form. Hiashi followed soon after and after a slight staring contest, they walked to Hiyashi's office. Which was not more than a blank white room with a small traditional-style desk in the middle. Moments after Hinata had fainted, Hiashi had called for the servant waiting just outside the door and motioned for Naruto to follow him. It had given both parties an opening to speak in a more private setting and Naruto was more than happy to oblige. He had some questions for the man. It wouldn't do to ask them in such a setting as they had been in. Hiashi poured himself and Naruto a small saucer of sake and pushed his saucer over to him. Both took a sip before Hiashi sighed and simply looked up with an impassive gaze. I am sorry to have done something like that with her present. However, I had to make sure I had her consent. I had planned on carefully maneuvering her during the meeting, but apparently, she had a crush on you even before all of this. Hiashi almost had a smug look on his face, and Naruto just scowled. You know as well as I do that I'm not one for diplomacy, Hiashi. Hiashi just smirked and nodded once, while Naruto shot him a tremendously annoyed glare. After a few more moments, Naruto sighed and took a sip of his sake before he composed himself. Why? What do you gain out of this? More specifically, what do I gain out of this? Naruto hated being in the dark, and he most certainly was not the one with the upper hand in this situation. Hiashi fixed his gaze on Naruto and let forth a resigned sigh. I suppose I should give you a bit of backstory first. In the laws of Konoha, it is stated that if someone from a family not on the council is ever elected as Hokage, then that family is automatically given a seat on the council, regardless of their family standing. In your case, since your father was Hokage, you rightfully inherit a seat on the council. Naruto's eyes were wide as saucers at this admission, and he barely restrained his urge to grin like a madman. If he had a seat on the council. Never again would they be able to endanger his life, nor would they be able to arbitrarily try to execute him. Not only that, but he would have power. The village would definitely recognize him, either through fearing him or loving him. He didn't much care which. Hiashi just held up his hand. It's not that easy, however. For one to be on the council, they must meet certain criteria. Firstly, they must be old enough to be considered adult in the eyes of the law. Or, in lieu of that, they must be married. Secondly, if the person is below that age, even if they are married, they must have I suppose you could call it a sponsor on the council to vouch for them. Thirdly. And you already meet this criteria. If their family is on the council due to the Hokage election rules, the member that sits on the council must be a ninja, no exceptions. Naruto seemed more subdued than he had been, and he looked as though he had a tremendously pensive look on his face. Hiashi just smiled before taking another sip of his sake. You are not of adult age, nor are you married. Even if you were married, you would need a sponsor. Which in this case, would be me. You are already a ninja. In effect, you fulfill 2 of the 4 criteria to sit on the village council, however, you must fulfill all 4 to gain your seat. That is why I was attempting to arrange something between yourself and Hinata. Naruto just nodded his head, as if he had already figured that much out. I understand that much rather easily. However, to properly take my seat, I would need to reveal myself to be my father's son. Which I really cannot do until I become stronger than I am. You know just as well as I do the types of enemies my father had, especially on the council. Hiashi just nodded and set down his sake saucer before fixing Naruto with a tremendously serious gaze. That is precisely why I invited you to tonight's dinner. Once news has spread of a private dinner with the Hyuga head, you will begin to be considered 9 nobility in the eyes of most of the village. Or at least, those who are able to look past the Kyuubi. This is merely the first step in getting you and the village ready. Naruto's eyes widened in comprehension and a slight smile formed itself on his lips. He had to give it to Hiashi. The man had experience. He was doing something that would effectively start the process of the village not hating him by a simple dinner. Hiashi just returned Naruto's smirk with his own. You see now? Good. Through the next few years, your reputation will grow within the village as Naruto. This means that by the time you really are strong enough to reveal your family name, the village as a whole will not hate you nearly as much as they do now. The village council will be powerless to stop your ascension if you have the backing of the people. Naruto just nodded dumbly. Political maneuvering wasn't exactly his forte, but it was certainly Hiashi's. The reasons why I am doing this for you are twofold. Firstly, I owe your father considerably. This is the least I can do for his progeny. Secondly, Once your name is revealed, the Hyuga will gain great clout if they are tied to you in any way. The clan will gain both notoriety and respect throughout the civilian populace, and you too will gain the respect of the Hyuga by default. In the end, everyone wins. Naruto nodded again. He was beginning to see the absolute genius that was Hyuga Hiashi. Hiashi just finished off his sake saucer and sighed. Of course, this will probably take years. You must be strong enough to defend yourself, the village must come to recognize you as more than a demon, and… well, we'll see what happens between you and Hinata. Hiashi just had a wide smirk on his face, and Naruto shot him another annoyed glare. What happens between Hinata and I will be natural if it is to happen at all. I won't have you pushing her on me, nor will I push myself on her. Damn the benefits, I will not take something as serious as the woman I will be with for the rest of my life and simply entrust it to an arrangement. Naruto's voice held conviction that Hiashi hadn't heard since. Well, Minato. He nearly smirked again. The boy had certainly inherited his father's stubborn streak of chivalry. Hiashi instead merely nodded. I understand completely. To be honest however. Hiashi trailed off, remembering Hinata's mother and the courtship they had been through together. At first, Hiashi had been the same way. But in the end, she had left him little choice in the matter. It was amazing how aggressive females could be when you were what they wanted and you gave them a little self-confidence. Of course, there was always the possibility that Naruto would. Well, he did need to revive his clan in more than one way. He chuckled, much to Naruto's confusion. Never mind. You'll understand when you're older. For now, I believe that it is getting late. For one, I have a meeting with a daimyo tomorrow, so I must retire early. I suggest you do the same. You have a medical exam tomorrow, if I remember correctly. Naruto just stared back at Hiashi, wondering just how in the hell the man had known that. He chuckled again before giving him a dismissive wave. You'll find that I know much more than you think I do. Hiashi stood up and waited for Naruto to do the same before he gave the boy a small smile. I have no doubts that your father would be proud of you, Naruto. Naruto just gave the man a guardedly happy smile before they both bowed to each other and left the room. Naruto was escorted to the gates by a branch member and just as he left the compound, the gates shut behind him with an audible bang. Naruto just stood there for a moment before he started to make his way back to his house. He couldn't help but shake his head and chuckle. This had certainly been an interesting night. Naruto walked up to the chair as he always did, sitting himself down for another lesson in anatomy. Or chemistry. Or biology. Or whatever Kyuubi deemed prudent to teach him. Kyuubi was simply sitting there reading her own book before she gave Naruto a grin and shut the book with an audible clap. So, how did it go? Naruto gave her a slightly exasperated grin and made himself comfortable before he sighed. Well. I'm in an arranged friendship with Hinata now. Hiashi wants me to marry her when I get older. Apparently I'll have a seat on the council if I do. Naruto watched as Kyuubi's expression went from stark blank to almost angry. Who is this Hinata? Why would marrying her get you a seat on the council? Naruto just sighed. He supposed he would have to relay the whole story. So he did. By the end, Kyuubi was giving him an expression that Naruto couldn't quite read. He wasn't exactly sure what that expression meant, but it was obvious that Kyuubi was perturbed about something. Is there something wrong with any of that? Kyuubi seemed to start for a moment before an obviously fake grin marred her features. No, nothing at all. I'm glad. Just concerned is all. Kyuubi's expression changed to one of pensive concern and Naruto waited for her to elaborate. After a few moments, Kyuubi looked at him with one of the most serious gazes she had ever fixed him with. If I get this straight. If you're married to someone before you become an adult, you gain a seat on the council, correct? Naruto simply nodded. He still had to have a sponsor, but that was taken care of through Hiashi. Kyuubi just looked away for a moment with a positively sad look, which Naruto wanted to comment on before Kyuubi perked up and waved him off. Ma. We can worry about that later. For now, I have something new I want to teach you. She walked to the bookcase and took a new book off the shelf before tossing it to Naruto. The title was The Chemistry of Explosives. Naruto just grinned. If there was a Cloud 9. She was on it. Hinata had quite possibly the widest grin on her face that any Hyuga through the decades had ever produced. She had him. Naruto, albeit through no actions of her own, was now her friend. He noticed her. Even if it was only in passing. Even if it was only at her father's prodding and because of political situations that she didn't quite understand. Naruto was now her friend. She didn't even care if he didn't want to be. At the moment, she would have settled for him simply having him be an acquaintance. The mere fact that she now ranked higher than any other girl she knew on Naruto's list of friends nearly sent her into a conniption fit. He was sure to notice her now. Right. Her grin faded slightly. Naruto was her friend because her father had all but forced him to be. The reality was slowly seeping into her mind and she didn't like it at all. Naruto wasn't her friend because she had finally asked him to be. Naruto wasn't her friend because they had gotten to know each other. They were friends because Naruto. She realized with a startled and sad expression that Naruto felt sorry for her. He had only realized that she had a crush on him after her father had all but forced her to admit it. He hadn't even had a hint of it beforehand. In fact, he downright thought that she didn't like him. Only because she had looked so pitiful. Like some sort of kicked puppy. Was he her friend? Naruto, her idol, her reason for power, her reason for being a ninja, felt sorry for her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to admit her feelings for him and he was supposed to return them in earnest and they would ride off into the sunset on a chariot with white horses and he would take her into his arms and they would whisper sweet nothings to one another until they were old and gray and their children were grown. No. This all started not with her admitting her feelings. Not with Naruto accepting them. Not with anything like it was supposed to. This was starting with Naruto feeling pity for her. The one person that she thought would acknowledge her. The one person that she knew would be her rock. He didn't feel love for her, or kinship, or even friendship, did he? He simply felt pity, and so, being the nice person that Hinata knew him to be, he took her as a friend because she was pitiful, and she needed it. She nearly choked on a sob and noticed that unbidden tears were soaking her pillow. Naruto wasn't her friend. She was his burden. A burden that her father had forced on him. A burden that Naruto didn't need, didn't want and couldn't cope with, but had anyway because she needed him and he was nice and she wasn't strong enough to take care of herself. At that moment, she realized that she truly was pitiful. Her reason for existence was Naruto. Her reason for being was Naruto. Her reason for being a ninja was Naruto. And he now held her in a light that one might hold a beggar or a slave in. Hinata silently cried herself to sleep, believing with utmost certainty that her blessing was somehow a curse. Naruto was giddy. Unrestrainedly giddy. He had thought anatomy was cool as far as intellectual subjects went. It taught someone the basics of disabling via pressure points, how to kill in a quick and efficient manner, and of course, how to heal more effectively. In effect, it was everything a young nin needed to be able to both heal and kill more efficiently. And then he had learned about the chemistry involved in explosions. Anatomy, by comparison, was boring. There were substances. Readily available substances. That would produce explosions that absolutely dwarfed those that could be produced by explosive notes. Explosive notes were simply sealed paper that held chakra. They went boom as they released that pent-up chakra. Which meant that the more chakra a note had, the larger the resulting explosion was. The problem with this was the fact that a piece of paper, no matter how complex the seal, could only hold so much chakra before it simply couldn't hold anymore. This gave explosive notes an unbreakable ceiling to their effectiveness and effectively prevented explosions larger than what one piece of paper could hold. Making explosives out of different types of materials, on the other hand, could produce explosions upwards of the magnitude of 10 times what a normal explosive note could do, and with only a small smattering of common materials, you could usually find at a simple apothecary or farmer's supply store. Not only that, but they didn't always have to be simple raw explosions. They could be penetrating explosions, meant to demolish bunkers. Area of effect explosions that took out entire regiments of troops. Controlled cascade explosions. The list went on, and Naruto found himself with an insatiable grin on his face that wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Kyuubi had taught him the most basic of the base when it came to explosives in general. However, even the most basic explosives were tremendously useful and tremendously powerful. There was a substance known as nitroglycerin. A highly explosive and highly volatile substance that could be formed by combining simple sugar alcohol with nitric and sulfuric acid. This, mixed with a cellulose compound that Naruto didn't quite understand, yet knew he could make readily, produced what was commonly referred to. Or used to be commonly referred to, as dynamite. This was a much less volatile, but still just as devastatingly explosive material that could be detonated by a simple chakra timer. The dynamite substance could be compacted into a small container and made into something Kyuubi had called a grenade. It was a hand-thrown projectile that exploded either on harsh contact or by timer mechanism. She had said that it was extremely useful in flushing out enemies and anyone caught in the blast radius of one of these grenades would undoubtedly be killed or very badly maimed. She had also explained about something known colloquially as the flash bang. Apparently, it was very aptly named. Using a mixture of magnesium and an ammonia compound, the flash bang would emit a tremendously bright flash of light and a very loud bang upon detonation. This detonation was not fatal. Instead, it was used to disorient opponents rather thoroughly. In effect, it was like putting someone under a timed jinjutsu that they simply couldn't dispel. The only problem with the flashbang was that it was easily the hardest thing he had yet learned how to make. He would have to set up a small chemistry lab to be able to produce the compounds needed, and he would need raw materials that he wasn't quite sure he could. Iubi had been adamant that he start as soon as possible in the manufacture of his newest ninja tools, citing that they took time to properly craft and that the materials he needed to gather might not be as readily available as he believed them to be. Naruto had of course complied. He was entirely too excited to want to wait to make the explosive devices Kyuubi had explained to him, and he had promised her that at the earliest possible convenience, he would find the materials they would need and start work on the chemistry lab. On top of all of that, he had taken a cursory test in basic to intermediate anatomy with the Kyuubi, and he had passed with flying colors. Even though he was only a few days into his tutoring under the fox, he had a very good working knowledge of the anatomy of the human body. It wasn't anything spectacular, mind you, but it was enough that given some practice, he could really make a great med nin. It was also enough, he thought, to be able to take the full-on beginner's medical ninja examination under Kabuto, and he had scheduled as such for later today, after his team got done with their normal regimen of boring and pointless D-ranked missions. He broke himself from his musings as he realized that his team wasn't there. He had been waiting at the bridge for close to 5 minutes now, and normally, Sakura would have shown up literally the second the clock signified it was time. He had never known her to be late, and the fact that she was put him off a bit. He didn't even spare a thought as to Kakashi's tardiness. Such a thing was to be expected. Even Sasuke was absent, even though Naruto believed him to have a slightly better excuse than the pink-haired banshee he had thought of earlier. He had undoubtedly left his teammate with some thinking to do. And he reminded himself that if Sasuke had managed to figure out his little test, that he would have some explaining to do later on. He got his mind churning on just what exactly he would tell Sasuke if in fact he did manage to pass. He wasn't sure he wanted Sasuke to know everything, but he supposed he should know something. His thoughts wandered towards his new friendship with both Tenten and now, Hinata. Tenten was an interesting personality, to say the least. She was feminine, but with a tomboy streak a mile wide. She was obviously a good ninja, and just by seeing her move, he could tell that she took her job seriously. He respected her for that much at least, and it only helped that she didn't seem to be some ditzy fangirl type. Fangirls were the epitome of troublesome. Hinata on the other hand was. He wasn't exactly sure what to make of the girl. Looking at the situation with nothing but logic yielded a scary realization that the girl had some serious confidence issues. No doubt this was caused in no small way by her father. He doubted that there was anyone else who had had such a tremendous impact on her life to cause such a serious problem unless Hanabi was somehow a banshee in disguise. He quickly put that thought out of his mind. She seemed like a more or less regular girl during the dinner. It was also obvious that the girl had some potential. Even the most untrained of genin could see that much. The girl's body was practically custom-made for lithe and quick movements, and that's exactly what the Gyuukin was. Or at least, that's what Naruto thought. Most of the Hyuga he had ever seen had lithe and taut body types, and he could only imagine that the fighting style that went along with that body type was something that focused on agility and speed. Gentle fist indeed. The only thing visibly standing in Hinata's way was her confidence issues. He supposed that she might have other faults, but considering that he didn't quite know the girl that well, he was unaware of them. His train of thought derailed slightly as he almost scowled. He was thinking like a sensei. Not a friend. His job, as it were, wasn't to teach the girl. It was to get to know her, befriend her. With a bit of a start, Naruto realized that he didn't quite know how to be a proper friend. It certainly wasn't his fault. Through his life, his only friends had been the Hokage, Iruka, and only very slightly, Sasuke. Iruka had been more of an older brother-father figure to him, the Hokage was more like a grandfather, and Sasuke was hardly proper friend material. Besides, Sasuke was technically his cousin. Family relations, no matter how distant or warped, were still family relations. He nearly shuddered. He was still getting used to the idea of being an uchiha. He remembered with a bit of a hopeful expression that Tenten had offered. Well. More like ordered him to let her teach him how to properly socialize. If he wanted to be a proper friend to Hinata and possibly a friend family member to Sasuke, he would certainly need that knowledge. He made a mental note to see Tenten sometime soon. He would certainly need her advice. He was broken from his musings as a slightly disheveled-looking Sakura strode onto the bridge, sending a furtive glare at him through half-lidded eyes. Behind his mask, Naruto just got an annoyed expression on his face and turned back to staring at the water below, not quite caring why she was late or why she looked so haggard, only caring that she was there and he didn't quite have to worry about it anymore. Sakura walked to the opposite end of the bridge from Naruto and slumped against one of the support posts before Naruto noted that her eyes shut and her breathing became steady once again. The girl was obviously exhausted, although from what, he had no clue. For a moment, he entertained the idea that she had been training, but noticing that the girl had no telltale wounds or bruises that would indicate as such, he dismissed the idea. The girl probably had just stayed up all night chattering about something meaningless with Ino. Or herself. Or. Naruto didn't care. He turned his attention back to the water, finding the movement of the fish much more exciting. He allowed his mind to drift off into a blank state for a while before he noticed that there was another figure approaching. One look told him that it was Sasuke, although he was surprised to see that Sasuke's normal scowl was. Well, it wasn't soft, but it certainly wasn't as antisocial as it usually was. For a moment, Sasuke almost looked forlorn before his visage once again became the new version of impassive that it had been before. Naruto almost quirked an eyebrow, but decided that if Sasuke wanted to tell him anything or talk to him, Sasuke would be the one to initiate it, not him. After a short while, Sasuke stood perched on the bridge directly parallel to Naruto, leaning over the railing so as to place him with his back to the blonde. There was an almost stir silence as Naruto and Sasuke both realized that Sakura had not only forgone shouting her traditional bleating to Sasuke, but that she was still very much asleep. Both boys thanked the heavens for small miracles. Naruto, realizing that they had another 3 hours or so to blow, began to go over things in his mind that he could do to pass the time. Training was a possibility, but in such a relatively public place, it was sure to be spotted by someone. Privacy was a virtue that he didn't have unless he was at the house. He could brush up on his anatomy, but considering that Kyuubi was having one of her not-cat naps, he wouldn't really have anyone to brush up with, thus defeating the purpose. After a few more moments of contemplation, he scowled. With his teammates around, he could scarcely read without them becoming suspicious and curious of his actions. And considering that he most certainly did not want to reveal anything about his abilities or what he was currently learning, having his teammates take a curiosity into his habits was a decidedly bad thing. Scowling for a few moments more, he chanced upon an idea that his teammates most certainly wouldn't notice. He could train his senses. Undoubtedly, they would notice chakra being channeled, but to what, they would have no idea. Over and above that, he didn't have to show them anything. It wasn't the best use of his time, but considering the circumstances, it was the best he could do. He focused the proper amount of chakra to his senses, finding that it was much easier now than it had been only days before. And opened himself up to the sights, sounds, and smells of his surroundings. Sakura used a shampoo that made her smell of flowers. Specifically, sakura flowers. Sasuke simply smelled of freshly washed laundry and a hint of mint. It was a tangy smell that he couldn't readily place, but it was definitely distinct. The bridge was obviously made of pine. The smell of cured pine wood was readily recognizable. And the water below him gave off almost no smell, a testament to its purity. The forest simply smelled like wood, dirt and. The best word he could attribute to it was nature, if one could attribute a word such as nature to any given smell. Through his ears, he could hear that Sakura's breathing was even more shallow than it had been before, which told him that she was now deeper in sleep than she had been when she initially got there. Sasuke's breathing was more defined, and his. Naruto cringed when he heard a pronounced clop in the general direction that Sasuke was in. The clop sounded a few more times, and Naruto rescinded the chakra from his ears just as he restrained a muted cry from escaping his lips. The amplification of sound was something that he still wasn't used to, and he wasn't sure if he ever would be. He turned his head to look at the source of the sound and found that Sasuke was standing directly behind him, a very unreadable and impassive expression on his face. Although, his foot was tapping rather nervously on the pine of the bridge. He surmised that the sound had been Sasuke walking towards him, and if he had kept his hearing amplified, the tapping of his teammate's foot would have probably driven him to madness. "What do you want?" Naruto watched as an impossible flinch crossed Sasuke's face at Naruto's inflection, but it dissolved almost as soon as it appeared. Naruto wondered briefly if he was seeing things. Sasuke did not flinch. Sasuke looked at him for a few moments more before he strode up to just next to Naruto and stared at the water as Naruto had been doing only moments earlier. Before Sasuke interrupted him, Naruto just cocked an eyebrow. He was being strangely subdued, even for him. A few more moments passed before Sasuke sighed slightly. "About what you said yesterday. About true power." He trailed off, lowering his gaze even further. "I think I know what you meant." Naruto simply quirked his eyebrow even further. "Do you really? Care to chance a guess?" Naruto seriously doubted that Sasuke had truly figured out his meaning, but he decided to humor him anyway. Sasuke stared impassively at the water for a few more moments before he sighed and closed his eyes. "Friends, family, and the need to protect them. I don't have family left. But I can always make friends." Sasuke's eyes opened and his gaze returned to the babbling brook, expression just as impassive as it had been. If he could have seen beyond Naruto's mask, he would have seen astonishment. He truly had believed the lesson of true power was beyond Sasuke's grasp. But he had been proved wrong. He wasn't sure if he was glad at that or miffed, but he decided that no matter his reaction, Sasuke's side of the bargain was met. He wouldn't tell him just yet that he was wrong about not having family. After a few moments of silence, Naruto turned his gaze back to the brook and sighed. I didn't expect that you would get it. I suppose I underestimated you. Sasuke's impassive expression broke for a moment as he smirked at Naruto and allowed the smile to reach his eyes. He couldn't really blame Naruto for expecting him not to get the lesson, but he couldn't help but feel a little gratified by the fact that he had proven Naruto wrong. A few more moments of silence passed before Naruto stood straight and faced Sasuke. Meet me at my place after about 4. I have something I have to do at the hospital before that. We can discuss more then. Sasuke too stood straight and faced Naruto, gazing into his mask's eye slits. He nodded his acceptance and returned to his perch on the bridge, mentally preparing himself for the discussion that they would have later on. Naruto leaned on the bridge and furrowed his brow in thought. This was a whole new situation. He had no idea what he wanted to tell Sasuke and what he wanted to keep a secret, at least for the time being. He figured that when the time came, he would probably simply know. Thinking on it too much would be about as detrimental as thinking too briefly. He let his mind float back into a blank state and let a ghost of a smile adorn his face. Perhaps Sasuke wasn't as much of an asshole as he thought. His superiors were very interested. In a few minutes, Naruto would be coming by for his medical examination and Kabuto was ready with just the test. Normally, someone who was testing to become a novice medic nin would get a large fish and be told to bring them back to life from air suffocation. It was a test of being able to simply show general regeneration skills via the application of medical chakra and only a small amount of general anatomical knowledge. Naruto, however, was different. And thus his test was going to be just as different. His superiors had recommended that Naruto's test be given in an unorthodox fashion, simply due to the fact that they both wanted to test the boy's overall skill and potential. If he was really as capable and as potentially strong as Kabuto told them he was, then they undoubtedly wanted to use him for their own purposes. Prodigies like Naruto came along only once every few decades, and powerful people like his superiors would be absolutely stupid not to use him to his limit. This test was set up to test Naruto's ability to improvise, as well as his overall ability to use his special chakra. If the seal on the boy worked as he thought, then Kabuto's door sounded with a swift 3 knocks, and with a call of acknowledgement, it opened to show the masked face of Naruto who was a bit disheveled and looked to be in a decidedly bad mood. Kabuto nearly smirked. Those looked like cat claw marks. The daimyo's wife's cat again. Kabuto had rescued that damned cat more times than he could count, and it seemed as though a new generation was dealing with the accursed animal all over again. Naruto scowled, even though Kabuto couldn't see it. Yeah. Damned cat had the audacity to try to escape using the sewers. I'd smell like shit if I hadn't used a cage bunshin instead. As it is, I remember the smell. Naruto's tone left no doubt that he was absolutely disgusted, and Kabuto didn't blame him. Kabuto instead just chuckled and motioned for Naruto to follow him to the examination room. Once they arrived, Naruto cocked his head in a confused gesture, and Kabuto just smiled. Normally, your test would be simply healing a fish, but I wanted to see just what you can do. If you manage to pass this test, you'll jump immediately to field medic level. Which is roughly equivalent to Chunin in Mednin terms. Kabuto watched as Naruto's posture straightened slightly, and his mood seemed to jump immediately. Well shit, what are we waiting for? What am I supposed to do? He smiled again. This man is missing a pinky finger. The test is simple. Grow it back. Naruto nearly choked. He had seen the man on the table under anesthesia when he first came in and assumed that he would be fixing something minor on the man. But growing back a finger? Sure, Naruto would be able to do it on himself, but that wasn't due to any medical influence, rather it was due to his healing factor. Was this even possible? Before he could voice his protests, Kabuto just chuckled and waved his hand dismissively. Normally, it wouldn't be possible without some very good skill and technique. However, I believe that if you were to somehow use that chakra, you would be able to accomplish it. Using the Kyuubi's chakra via the medical seal. It wasn't something he had even thought of before. But truly, if it were possible. The regenerative properties of her chakra along with the conversion that the seal performed. It might just work. Or it might just poison him and render him in even worse shape than he was before. Furthermore, I'm not sure the seal was designed with my chakra in mind. Kyuubi sounded somewhat peeved. At what, Naruto wasn't sure, but at the moment, it wasn't exactly the most important thing to him. Whether the seal was designed with your chakra in mind or not is beside the point. If it works. The possibilities are endless. I won't have a chance to test it like this again. Naruto didn't exactly need Kyuubi's permission, but it was better than simply doing it without her consent. For a few moments, everything was quiet in Naruto's mind before a distant-sounding sigh made itself present in his conscious. Fine. If it doesn't work, however, don't come crying to me about it. Naruto gave what amounted to a mental nod and then gave a real nod to Kabuto, who simply smiled and motioned him over to the table. If it doesn't work, then I'll have you simply go on to the fish exercise. This is mostly an experiment anyway. Naruto simply nodded again and placed his hands over the man's hand, focusing on the spot where his pinky should have been. He concentrated for a moment and then with a slight green glow, healing chakra danced on his hands faintly. He had activated a seal, nothing more. Kyuubi's chakra wasn't flowing to his hands yet. With a mental push, the gateway between his chakra and Kyuubi's opened and with another mental push, her chakra began flowing through the medical seal and out his hands. The effects were instantaneous. The green chakra surrounding his hands got darker, resembling a forest green, and his raw chakra output nearly tripled. The chakra flowed into the man's hand at a much more hurried pace, and after only a few seconds, Naruto could see the beginnings of his pinky finger regenerating. Naruto mentally kept the chakra from flowing into the man anywhere else other than his hand, and after a few more seconds, his pinky was almost 3/4 of the way completely regenerated. Naruto was ecstatic. It worked. He could use Kyuubi's chakra through the medical seal. Using this, he could conceivably regenerate a person's entire physical body in mere minutes of application and heal those even on death's doorstep. And then the pain came. His stomach felt like it was on fire and the feeling was slowly seeping outward from the place where his seal was. He had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. The chakra on his hands violently fluctuated again and he had to fight to keep the chakra localized. He could hear the Kyuubi in the back of his mind trying to tell him to stop, but he paid it no mind for now. He was almost there. The pinky finger was almost completely regenerated and with another push of chakra, his hands glowed fiercely for a moment and the finger was completely regenerated. Naruto let out a sigh of relief and released his chakra flow to his hands and to the seal. He wondered briefly just what had happened, but for the moment, he pushed it out of his mind, preferring to focus on the fact that he had just passed the test. He turned around and gave a thumb up to a smiling Kabuto before he promptly passed out. He found himself in the confines of the seal again, staring at a very irate, very pissed off Kyuubi. I told you, didn't I? The seal was not made with my chakra in mind. Do you realize what could have happened? Even as it is, I'm not sure of the damage you've done. Naruto simply sighed. The important thing is that it works, at least for a little while, right? If someone were really in bad shape, I could do this to keep them alive. It's obviously a last resort type of thing. Kyuubi looked at him again with the same firm expression, but this time with a hint of resignation. When Naruto had his mind set on something, it was like trying to pry titanium with bare hands to get him off of it. That much is true. But you obviously have some sort of a time limit. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but I do know that it caused you physical damage. I don't think it damaged the seal, however. We're lucky for that much at least. Naruto just nodded and sighed. They both sat around in relative silence for a few minutes before Naruto leaned back and lay on the grass under him, letting his mind self-relax. What do you think I should tell Sasuke? Kyuubi quirked an eyebrow and let herself fall into the grass as well. After a few moments of contemplation, she simply sighed. I really can't tell you that. He's going to be your friend, not mine. You have to decide what you do and don't want him to know. But if he's going to be training with you, he should probably know about me. Naruto simply gasped. He had forgotten that part of the deal was mutual training. This meant that unless he wanted to stoke Kyuubi permanently during training, he would have to either tell Sasuke the truth or make something up. He was leaning towards making something up, but then again, real friends didn't really do that to each other. Not that he was above that. If they were really going for this friendship thing, then he would have to decide just how far he would take it and how fast. After a few more minutes of silence, Kyuubi sighed again, which caused Naruto to look over at her. She had an almost concerned expression on her face. I don't know why. But I don't really trust Kabuto. Be careful around him, okay? Naruto simply raised his eyebrows and gave a confused stare to Kyuubi. Seeing this, she figured she should elaborate. He smells like snake. Not much of a reason. But. Naruto nearly smirked. In nature, foxes hated snakes. And it seemed that some traces of her old instincts still lingered. Nevertheless, he trusted her instincts almost implicitly at this point. She had yet to be wrong about things regarding character assessment. I'll keep that in mind, but he seems like a pretty good person to me. He knows about you and doesn't seem to hate me for it. And he's well-mannered and good-natured. Naruto stopped for a second, realizing that no one had been as outwardly nice to him as Kabuto had been, especially those that knew about the Kyuubi and weren't somehow figures of authority. Kyuubi, seeing his epiphany, simply smirked. Yeah. He's almost too nice. It could just be paranoia. But something just bugs me about him. Naruto simply nodded and went back to watching the faux clouds in the sealscape. He would worry about Kabuto later. For now, he was just content with the fact that he was now a full-fledged medic nin and he was at peace, even if he was technically passed out. It was turning out to be a good day. He closed his eyes and drifted off, never noticing Kyuubi staring at him with a smile on her face. He imagined that this was his penance for not listening to Kyuubi. He felt horrible. In every conceivable way, he felt horrible. It was as if he had just been through full-body acupuncture with rusty chainsaws. Not exactly the best feeling in the world. He had awoken only minutes earlier to a sterile matte gray ceiling and a sterile-smelling room that immediately reminded him of where he was. He had found a note from Kabuto who had basically alluded to the fact that he was now a fully certified medical ninja and had included all the normal congratulations due to him. Naruto couldn't help but smile slightly. Even if Kabuto wasn't someone who he should be trusting absolutely implicitly, it was still nice to be acknowledged. With a grunt of effort, he finished donning his accoutrement and limped out the door, forcing himself through pure will and grit to not wince every time he moved. Whatever his little experiment had done to him had greatly hindered his ability to move or even generate chakra. It was like the effects of lactic acid on the muscles, except spread throughout every system of his body. He figured that whatever it was, he'd have to experiment as to how to get rid of it later. Even if this was a last resort technique, he didn't want to feel like this every time he used it. After he successfully made it out of the hospital, he found a bench and plopped himself down on it, breathing heavily. His body was simply running on fumes. Something was definitely wrong, and he had to figure out how to get rid of this, else he would be weaker than a child until it went away. Apparently, Kyuubi had already figured it out. While you were dozing off, I took a look at exactly what you did to your body. And while it's interesting, I don't think you like it. Naruto gulped. The medical seal works by conversion, right? Well, to convert my chakra, it has to filter many more. I suppose the best word would be impurities out of it than it would if it were using your chakra. Those impurities have to go somewhere, and apparently, the seal is designed to put those impurities into your own body, to be filtered out using my chakra as a secondary filter. The problem occurs when my chakra is used to try to purge impurities caused by the same chakra that created the impurities in the first place. It's like trying to clean a dirty surface using dirty water. Naruto sighed. It made sense. So how do I get rid of the impurities then? If your chakra can't filter it, then how can mine? To Naruto's chagrin, he heard what sounded like chuckling coming from the back of his head. Remember the purification seals. You have 18 of them. My chakra is converted to normal chakra via these seals, and in a way, the medical seal is roughly the same way. Except with the regular purification seals, the impurities are neutralized by using your own chakra to dilute them and eventually cast them off when you use chakra. However, because of the purification seals, your own chakra is more potent than usual. Because of this, your own chakra is able to purge the impurities of my chakra due to its similarity in potency, but discrepancy in purity. In this case, you'll basically have to flare your own chakra for a few minutes to purge your system. Pretty simple really. Naruto almost smiled in relief. So basically I just use chakra for a few minutes to get rid of it. Getting a mental nod from Kyuubi, Naruto really did smile. He thought it was going to be something complicated. Forming a ram seal, he concentrated on his own chakra, heedless of control, and simply let the floodgates open. A fierce blue storm erupted around him almost immediately, and he could literally feel the impurities in his system being cast off into the wind as so much trash. It felt good to be able to simply let loose his chakra regardless of control for once, and he smiled at the fact that he could feel his reserves already refilling, even as he was using his chakra fully. He continued this for about a minute until he felt 4 different sources of chakra converging on him at a very quick rate. He continued to flare his chakra, but now he stood and took a defensive posture, his right hand just over the hilt of his sword and his left in a guarded position directly parallel to him. He had no idea who was coming toward him, but whoever they were, they each had almost as much chakra as he did. In fact, one of them probably had more, and that was saying something. It soon became clear that he hadn't needed to take up a defensive posture. From the rooftops came the Hokage, complete with 2 masked Anbu and his sensei in tow. With a confused cock of the head, he slid out of his defensive stance and simply stared at the Hokage as he looked at Naruto with concern, curiosity and just a hint of panic. The look was reflected somewhat in Kakashi's eye as well, and after a few moments, Naruto realized just what had happened. He resisted the urge to slap himself on the forehead. The Hokage all but ran up to Naruto as he was flaring his chakra and with an even more concerned visage, gave Naruto a questioning glance. Naruto, just what's going on? I felt your chakra flare in the Hokage tower and thought that you were under attack, or perhaps you'd been injured. He trailed off, noticing that Naruto was now scratching the back of his head in typical Naruto fashion. Naruto simply let out a small embarrassed chuckle and continued to scratch the back of his head. Sorry about that, Aji-san. I kind of had a weird thing happen with my medical exam and needed to get rid of some impurities in my system by using my own chakra to purge it clean. Didn't realize that I was using so much. Naruto turned down his chakra output to normal levels and felt his body for any lingering traces of the impurities. Finding none, he smiled slightly. He did feel much better than he had a few minutes ago. Instead of the Hokage's face calming down, it seemed to become even more concerned. What sort of weird thing happened? Does it have to do with that? Naruto just sighed and nodded his head. The Hokage just closed his eyes and sighed before motioning the Anbu trailing him to return to their posts. Kakashi kept his somewhat concerned gaze on Naruto, and Naruto just prepared himself to explain. The Hokage sat down on the bench and motioned for Naruto to do the same, which he complied with. Kakashi just crossed his arms and leaned against the fence surrounding the hospital. Please explain just what happened, Naruto. Naruto sighed. For the medical examination, Kabuto had me regenerate someone's pinky finger by running that chakra through the seal instead of my own. The Hokage's eyes widened imperceptibly, and Kakashi's own cyclopean gaze became one of slight shock at hearing that Kyuubi's chakra could be used to heal people just as well as normal chakra. Naruto just sighed again and leaned back against the bench. The problem is that the medical seal has to filter out the impurities of the chakra it uses before it can really work. Normally, the impurities of my own chakra would simply be purged by that chakra and everything would be fine. Except that chakra can't filter the impurities that it itself created. She used the analogy of saying that it's like cleaning a dirty surface with dirty water. So, to get rid of these impurities, I have to literally flare my own chakra, which has its natural potency increased by that chakra, to cleanse my system. That's what I was doing just now, and it seemed to work rather well. The Hokage and Kakashi both had slightly incredulous expressions on their face by the end of the explanation, and Naruto couldn't suppress a slight grin, even though no one saw it. It was nice to be able to dumbfound the strongest ninja in the village and his sensei in one felt swoop. After a few more moments of silence, the Hokage sighed and stood up while shaking his head slightly. I never would have thought that using that chakra as a healing medium for anyone other than yourself would work. That seal on your stomach is truly remarkable. However, I don't want you using that particular way of healing anymore unless you absolutely have to, alright? Naruto just nodded. I've already decided to use it only as a last resort sort of thing. It hurts too much during and afterwards to do it all the time. The Hokage nodded and Kakashi just smiled slightly, both resolving to have a little talk with Kabuto at some time in the future. While he may have been the impetus of a great new healing technique, he was playing with fire a bit too freely for both of their tastes. Sarutobi sighed and stood before walking towards the street once again. Well, at least it was a good diversion from paperwork. You always seem to be good for that, Naruto. Naruto just scratched the back of his head embarrassedly and they both could sense a smile underneath Naruto's mask. The Hokage began to walk away before he was stopped by a little piece of wisdom from Naruto. Aji-san. If paperwork is such a bother, why don't you use Kage Bunshin to get it done more quickly? He quickly stopped in his tracks and froze for a moment before he began laughing rather heartily. An action that Kakashi mimicked slightly as well. Naruto cocked an eyebrow at this, but resolved to wait until both of them stopped laughing to ask just what they were laughing at. Before he could voice his question, however, the Hokage just shook his head and gave off a resigned sigh while in the middle of laughing. Only you would think of such a simple solution to a big problem. I dare say, you've just beaten the most persistent and difficult enemy any Kage has ever faced. Sarutobi turned around and almost beamed at Naruto, who was even more confused than he had been before. Why on earth hadn't they thought of this before he did? He thought that there would be some sort of detrimental effect to it that stopped them from using it, hence why it wasn't already done. He expected that his comment would simply be explained away. But they really hadn't thought of that. What kind of Kage was he? The Hokage just gave another resigned chuckle and shook his head. That's an excellent idea, Naruto. I think I'll start using that as soon as I get back to the tower. Kage Bunshin to defeat paperwork. What a marvelous idea. Why didn't I think of that? Naruto cocked another eyebrow at the muttering Hokage before he simply shook his head and chuckled himself, writing it off as an idiosyncrasy of all Kages. Perhaps paperwork was more of a devil than he gave it credit for. Sarutobi patted Naruto on the head and with a smile, poofed away back towards the tower, undoubtedly to tackle his hordes of paperwork with renewed vigor, while Kakashi smiled at Naruto and motioned for him to follow. I'll treat you to some ramen for passing the medical ninja examination. At the mention of ramen, Naruto couldn't help but smile a bit. It was still his greatest weakness, even with his new persona and new ideals. He resigned himself to being a ramen addict for the rest of his life, even though he really couldn't find anything bad about it. Who didn't like ramen? Yamanaka Ino hated ramen. With every fiber of her being, she hated the stuff. It was fattening, it was entirely plebeian, and it was completely devoid of any flair. In short, it was the food of commoners, and Yamanaka Ino was not a commoner. Hence, why she raised such a fuss when Chaoji decided unilaterally that her team would visit Ichiraku Ramen for their obligatory after-mission meal. Normally, they would visit the local BBQ joint that Chaoji seemed to adore, but apparently, today, his palate was set completely on ramen. For reasons that Ino couldn't quite comprehend. Chaoji had explained it as divine intervention or some such thing, and Shikamaru simply hadn't put up a fight. He never ate anything when they went out anyway. He simply went along with whatever Ino or Chaoji wanted to do. It was his nature as a Nara. For what seemed like the 100th time, she sighed and poked at the vegetarian ramen in front of her with little interest. It wasn't that it didn't taste good. If she was honest with herself, it tasted great. But it wasn't what she was supposed to eat. It didn't have anything redeeming to it. No nutritional value, no weight loss benefits, no style. It simply wasn't her type of food. Disregarding this for a moment, she checked to see if anyone was watching, and seeing that no one was, she dug into the ramen for a moment, savoring the taste. As long as no one actually saw her eat the stuff, it was alright. She absent-mindedly listened to Chaoji and Shikamaru talk about something mundane and assume a flirt with a girl. If she remembered correctly. With little interest. The past few days had been positively boring. Aside from a late-night girl talk session with Forehead. In which she learned that Naruto was apparently a poo-poo head or some such thing, she simply hadn't had anything to liven up the relative monotony that was the condition of being a genin. D-ranked missions and eating with her team was the highlight of her life the past few days. She perked slightly when a one-eyed jounin and a masked, sword-wielding ninja with darker blonde hair ambled into the stand and ordered ramen. The blonde much more than the jounin. The stand owners seemed to know the blonde rather well, and he bantered back and forth with them rather easily. Seeing that no one was paying any attention to her, she immediately went into girl mode. And began checking the newcomer out, seeing as how he was about her general age. He was well built, that much was for certain. He had nice tanned skin, and his hair was shaggy and wavy, almost like fur. He had a deeper almost baritone voice that was silky and lilting, and Ino could have sworn she had heard it before. At the start, she realized that the kid was removing his mask to start to eat his ramen, and she stared at his face, hoping to get a good look of some prospective eye candy. When his mask was completely off, Ino gasped. 3 cleft whisker marks on each cheek. Black eyes. Long face. Her mind put it all together in one instant, and she couldn't help but openly gape. That was Naruto. Since when did he become so drop-dead gorgeous? With his mask off, the picture was completed. And what a picture it was. He held an almost bestial appeal to him. His whisker marks making him almost feral. His eyes looking tough, reserved, and full of humor at the same time. His face was matured and hardened, yet boyish and charming at the same time. It all went perfectly with his bulky yet unrestricted build, and Ino found herself with an incurable blush the likes of which hadn't adorned her face since she had glumped Sasuke back at the academy. Hell, even the way Naruto ate ramen was sensual and even a bit sexy. Ino was light years ahead of other girls when it came to her more feminine side, and because of this, she could recognize when a guy was just simply too damn sexy for his own good. As Naruto, in Ino's mind, sensually slurped the ramen, Ino's blush became even more pronounced than it had been before, and she realized with a start that she was almost drooling at simply looking at Naruto eat. She mentally shook herself. While he may be gorgeous, he was still Naruto. Hunk or not, he was still a silly, immature, loudmouth brat. Boy, Kakashi-sensei. I was wondering, would it be possible for you to help train me in chakra natures? I kind of hit a glass ceiling with my jutsu training until I learned my various natures. And while she is a big help, she doesn't know much about the nature of chakra. Naruto was turned towards his sensei now, showing the back of his head to Ino in the process. She nearly gasped. The nature of chakra? That was something you didn't learn about until you hit Chunin, at least. Or at least, her father had told her as much. Kakashi seemed to think for a moment before he nodded his head slightly. I can only really help you with fire and earth. You'll have to find someone with a wind nature to help you out there, even though I can give you some general training in that regard. Ino couldn't help herself this time and actually did gasp. 3 chakra natures. From what little her father had tutored her in, having anything more than 2 was absolutely remarkable. And to have 3. Naruto smiled, and that made Ino's blush return full force. It is a primal smile that was malicious, mischievous and happy at the same time. It reminded her curiously of a fox. That's good enough, I suppose. Do you know anyone with wind nature chakra that can help me out? You said something about some guy named Asuma before. This time, Shikamaru, Chaoji and Ino all sweat dropped. Here he was sitting right next to the guy and he didn't know who he was. Kakashi simply chuckled and pointed behind Naruto to a now fully interested Asuma. Naruto blinked a few times before he smiled again. You're Asuma. Nice to meet you, I'm Naruto. He gave a slight bow of the head which Asuma returned with amusement before he took another puff on his cigarette and smirked. You have an affinity with wind. That's rare. Not many people in Konoha with that affinity. Naruto just scratched the back of his head and smiled again. Yeah, so I was told. I guess you're the guy to ask when it comes to learning about it, right? Asuma smirked again. Yeah. I'm the only jounin that I know of with a wind affinity, so most people with that affinity come to me. Tell you what kid, I'll write you up a scroll on the nature of wind chakra and even a few wind jutsu I know if you'll get the tab on this ramen excursion of ours. Naruto seemed to think for a moment before he nodded. Sounds fair enough. Though, I don't really need those jutsu. I've got a whole bunch of them that I can learn from an archive. Although, you may have some that the basement doesn't. Asuma quirked an eyebrow and looked at Kakashi who simply smiled obliviously. Since when did you have access to an archive of jutsu, kid? Naruto just smirked. Since a few days ago. But that's not important. When should I get this scroll from you? Asuma quirked another eyebrow but decided that the boy's secrets were his own. And they couldn't be that bad if Kakashi wasn't worried. Come to training ground 10 tomorrow at around 8. I'll give it to you then. Naruto simply nodded and returned to eating his ramen full tilt. Asuma smirked again and took another puff on his cigarette before he returned to flirting with the waitress behind the counter again. Kakashi took out an orange-colored book that looked to be of a perverted nature and began reading, while Choji and Shikamaru got back into another discussion on something relatively mundane. Ino, on the other hand, was floored. Her perceptions of one blonde-haired idiot were now effectively shattered. He had access to 3 different chakra affinities. He had drastically changed his look. He was absolutely hot. Moreover, the boy apparently had access to some sort of jutsu archive. It was enough to make Ino question just why Sakura hated the boy. She could find nothing wrong with him. Ino drifted off into her own thoughts as Naruto finished and somehow made Kakashi pay the tab, resulting in a comedic scene that Ino would have undoubtedly found funny if she weren't so immersed in her own little world. Kakashi and Naruto got up and left in different directions, while Asuma bade his team farewell, Shikamaru and Choji leaving soon after. Ino only barely realized that she herself was now walking towards home and with a start, she realized that she was at her front door. Walking in, she saw her father sitting in a recliner, reading some book on psychology. Her father, seeing that his daughter had a slightly dazed look on her face, decided to ask if anything was wrong. Ino just looked at him before she shook herself and thought for a moment. Dad. What do you know about a boy named Naruto? Naruto allowed himself to relax. Truly, it was a novel pleasure. Since his training had begun, he had not had but a few moments of time wherein he had allowed himself simply to rest. This was one of those times. As he sat in the onsen, contemplating his upcoming conversation with Sasuke, he allowed his muscles and mind to be drained of any and all stress they had accumulated over the last few days. He was in a form of heaven. His time in heaven was abruptly brought to an end by a knocking sound from his front door and a growling sound from Kyuubi. He scowled. Sasuke was early. With a grunt, he brought his form out of the private onsen and threw on an impromptu bathrobe before making his way back to the house and to the front door, making sure that Kyuubi was in her fox form on the way. Looking through the peephole, he saw the telltale face of Sasuke and with another half scowl, he opened the door. It wasn't that he didn't want him here, it was just. He was early, damn it. He was having fun doing nothing. The two just stood there for a moment as if sizing each other up before Naruto motioned for Sasuke to enter. Sasuke took a seat on the rather sizable couch in the middle, while Naruto went to his kitchen to fetch refreshments. There was nothing better for stick-up-the-ass syndrome than a good shot of warm sake. That much Naruto was absolutely sure of. After a few minutes, Naruto emerged with 2 bottles of slightly warm sake and after handing one of them to Sasuke, he sat down in his designated recliner and took a sip, relishing the warm burning feeling once again. He noticed that Sasuke was just staring at him incredulously and throwing confused glances towards both him and the sake bottle resting in his hand. Naruto couldn't help but chuckle slightly. It's sake, Sasuke. You know, rice alcohol. Take a swig, you like it. Naruto couldn't help but smirk at Sasuke's even more incredulous reaction to his assertion of it being alcohol. The boy certainly needed to loosen up. Sasuke stared at him for a few moments before he stared at the sake bottle for a few seconds. Before he stared at Naruto again. And then back to the sake bottle. Before he finally took a tentative swig. Sasuke grimaced ever so slightly at the sensation of it pouring down his throat. Which caused Naruto's smirk to widen. And then he took another sip. Naruto couldn't help but outright smile at the boy's quick acceptance of the beverage. If anyone could use some brain-killing stuff like sake, it was Sasuke. After a few more moments of tentative silence, Naruto took another sip off his bottle and sighed. He had no idea what he wanted to tell him. Even though he had thought that when the moment came, he would know. He simply didn't. This was an entirely different situation than with Hiashi or Kaseki or Hinata or even Tenten. Sasuke was his rival, one of his first friends by a relatively tentative definition of the word, and one of the most reserved personalities he had ever encountered. If he wasn't careful, he could alienate him just as easily as he could break him or even endear him in a platonic fashion. Damn, this is awkward. His muttering was apparently heard by Sasuke, who simply smirked and nodded slightly. Naruto couldn't help but chuckle slightly. At least they agreed on that much. He took another swig of his sake as he scowled. They didn't need some damn deep discussion. He would save that stuff for the soap operas. For now, he had an idea. Hey, Sasuke, what say we just go to a bar or something? Maybe that'll loosen us up. Sasuke just looked up startled again and gave Naruto a sort of "Are you kidding?" look. Naruto smirked. For all his mystery, Sasuke was entirely too tight. Naruto stood up and made his way to the staircase. I'm going to go change out of this bathrobe and then we can head out. He noticed that Kyuubi was following him on his heels, giving him what amounted to a fox's equivalent of a confused stare. Naruto couldn't help but smirk even wider. He knew this was a good idea. After he got changed into his usual attire, he got ready to go back downstairs when Kyuubi in her human form stood at the doorway, arms crossed over her chest with a slightly firm expression. Naruto quirked an eyebrow. The bar? Is there a reason why you can't get plastered here at home? Kyuubi's tone left little doubt that she was both concerned and perturbed at the same time. Naruto sighed. I'm not going to a bar to get plastered. Social environment seemed to loosen people up and the atmosphere downstairs is so tense you could cut the tension in the air with a kunai. That's not exactly conducive to conversation. Kyuubi just scowled but seemed to accept it nonetheless. She reverted to her fox form rather quickly and hopped up onto Naruto's shoulders, settling into her familiar place just under Naruto's chin. Naruto smiled. He always liked that familiar pressure around his neck that she provided. He made his way downstairs, noticing that Sasuke was admiring the sword on the mantel. He walked over to where Sasuke was standing and smirked. That belonged to my father. The one on my back is a smaller version that I use because I'm not exactly tall enough to wield that one yet. Sasuke looked over at Naruto. Specifically, the sword on his back, and nodded. My father had a sword as well. He didn't ever really use it. It was mostly for decoration and ceremony. He did say that it was battle ready though. Maybe. Sasuke seemed to think for a moment before he shook his head and started to walk towards the door. Naruto quirked an eyebrow but said nothing. Walking over to the door, he opened it before locking it and following Sasuke out, closing it with a soft click. They both made their way out onto the street, both of them still unconsciously carrying their sake bottles. You know, maybe it would have been a good idea to find a bar to go to before we just blindly set out. Naruto couldn't help but agree. They'd been at this for the better part of an hour and a half. Currently, Naruto and Sasuke were strolling the part of Konoha that was referred to as downtown. There were bars, clubs, restaurants. And as Naruto had noticed, several houses of ill repute. They had their pick of bars of which to choose from, and they had absolutely no idea which one exactly they should go into. Some looked to be high-class affairs, while others were the very picture of seedy. They had been strolling for a good portion of time already, but had not found a bar that they both agreed on. They had both finished their respective sake bottles about 30 minutes ago. And they were both much more loose for it. The sake had given them both a slight buzz. Sasuke a bit more than Naruto. And they were both a bit more free with their emotions and facial expressions than they would be otherwise. Currently, they were both in a sour mood, the effect of walking around looking for a place to drink for an hour and a half, taking its toll on the two. It certainly wasn't the best use of their time. They both stopped when they saw a completely unmarked, unnamed bar that had nothing but a picture of a kunai on the window pane. The only thing that gave it off as a bar was the fact that there was a steady smell of alcohol wafting out the front door and that a few ninja had already come stumbling out, more than slightly inebriated. Sasuke turned to look at Naruto, who simply nodded. Walking in the front door, they were greeted by quite the scene. Tables were set up in a half-moon configuration around what looked to be a lounge stage. A bar counter stood at the back of the room and the place was only dimly lit. The surfaces were made mostly of worn but sturdy wood and the place smelled of booze, tobacco and just a hint of substances that Naruto and Sasuke didn't exactly want to think about. They also noticed that they were being stared at by almost the entire patronage of the bar itself. It was only now that Naruto realized that the youngest people here, aside from themselves, were probably in their early 20s. That wasn't to say that they weren't allowed. Or at least, Naruto didn't think they weren't allowed. But perhaps the patronage of two 12-year-old genins wasn't something they were particularly used to. The gruff-looking ninja with an eye patch and a cigar walked up to them, a stern yet somewhat amused look on his face. What are you two kids doing here? This isn't the place for children, you know. Naruto scowled, though you couldn't see it. Sasuke, on the other hand, made up for that fact with his own patented uchiha death glare. We stopped being children the moment we became ninja, fool. Perhaps you'd like a demonstration of that fact. Sasuke subconsciously lowered his right hand to just above his kunai holster, and Naruto readied his right hand to draw his sword. Sasuke didn't know if they could take him. He was probably a chunin. But they would sure as hell try. It's not exactly as if they wanted to fight. Or at least, they wouldn't admit to such. But no one called them children and got away with it. The gruff-looking man got an even more amused look on his face, chomping at his cigar and blowing the smoke out of the left side of his mouth. After a moment, he simply laughed. "You're genin, aren't you? I doubt you could take me, kid. Besides, you ain't even old enough to drink. Scram before I call your mommies." That did it. Naruto drew his sword and held it in a basic stance, while Sasuke just drew his kunai, getting into the basic academy defense stance. Kyuubi almost squealed. She had wanted to fight for a while, but Naruto hadn't let her. She jumped down from her perch on Naruto's neck and growled at the man, even though it came out as barely a squeaking sound. Naruto smirked behind his mask. "We're old enough to kill, we're old enough to drink. And we're certainly old enough to kick your ass." With that, Naruto switched his sword to his right hand and brought it up above his head, pointing the sword at the man while shifting his weight to his back foot. His stance presented the minimal aspect to the enemy, and it had been drilled into his head as the usual starting stance that her sensei used when starting to fight. His left foot was placed forward, extended away from his body, and his left was crouched underneath him, providing a quick springing motion if necessary. His left hand was out away from his body, much like his left foot, and his sword arm made a crescent shape above his head, holding his sword perpendicular to his body. Sasuke saw Naruto get into a battle stance and decided to do the same, drawing another kunai and crossing them in front of him in a backhanded grip, feet spread wide. He still wasn't sure that they could take him, but if it came down to it, they could burn this place to the ground. Sasuke smirked at that idea. He could easily pay the damages if necessary. It would be worth it. Kyuubi glanced at Naruto before turning her attention back to the bouncer. "We need to work on your stance later on. And don't even think about trying to use Ryudo with it yet. You'd be slower than if you just used your feet." Naruto smirked before nodding mentally towards Kyuubi. Kyuubi just smirked right back. She could feel Naruto pumping her full of chakra, almost to the point of overflow, and she grew only slightly larger before she could take no more. She readied herself to possibly even take her human form if absolutely necessary. At least then she could use Ryudo for a few moments if things got really out of hand. Naruto was the first to move. Springing off of his left foot, he tried for a simple impaling maneuver on the bouncer. The bouncer smirked and dodged to the left, drawing his own kunai in the process. He was about to go back after Naruto when a kunai incoming from Sasuke made him dodge back to his right. Naruto took advantage of this, twirling haphazardly and going for a simple slashing maneuver across the man's chest area. It missed when the man crouched slightly to avoid it, and he jumped upwards afterwards to avoid another kunai thrown by Sasuke. He came back down on his haunches in time to throw a sweeping kick in Naruto's direction, which Naruto managed to jump over while at the same time drawing a shuriken from his hip pouch. He made to throw it and the Chunin made to dodge, but Kyuubi had bitten down onto his heel rather forcefully, rooting the man to the ground for a moment. That's all Naruto needed. His shuriken flew through the air towards the man, at the same time that Sasuke launched a flying kick at the man's head. The kick connected right before the shuriken did, sending the man tumbling away with a shuriken stuck into his flak jacket just below his diaphragm. Kyuubi leaped away with vulpine grace, and Sasuke got back into a defensive position, this time without any kunai in his hands. Naruto and Sasuke both wore a smirk, even though you could only see Sasuke's, and Naruto got back into his initial stance again, ready to try the impaling maneuver once more. The man's cigar was still in his mouth, but this time his mouth was curved into a vicious glower. "You brats. No one comes here and does that to me, no one." He drew a kunai of his own and tossed it at Sasuke rather forcefully, resulting in Sasuke dodging to the left. Right into the path of the man's punch. He tried to find an object to use Kawarimi with, but upon finding that he couldn't quite make it, he braced himself for the impact. Or at least, the impact he thought would come. Naruto had once again tried for the impaling maneuver. But this time, it worked. Naruto's sword was stuck clean through the man's thigh, a small river of blood running down the blade's edge. Sasuke was stunned for only an instant before he drew his right hand back and punched the man in the face forcefully, sending him tumbling backwards and forcefully dislodging Naruto's sword from his thigh. This time, Naruto just stared, stunned at both the fact that his maneuver had worked and at what he had just done. Getting into a bar fight was one thing. Seriously wounding a fellow Konohinin in a bar fight, possibly resulting in the man's permanent disability or death was completely another. Naruto wasn't exactly sure if he had nicked the man's femoral artery or not, but the raw amount of blood gushing out of the man's thigh was proof that he probably had. He cursed and laid down his sword before rushing over to the man, funneling chakra to his medical seal. He knelt down beside him, noticing the man's stunned and slightly frightened expression, as well as the increasing pallor of his face. He cursed again. Damn. Hold on, I'll heal you. This might hurt. The man just looked at him incredulously for a moment before nodding faintly. By this time, a small crowd of ninja had gathered around, some of them being faces that Naruto recognized. He cringed. If this guy died, he was in deep shit. He decided that he had absolutely no choice. With a mental push, he directed Kyuubi's chakra to the seal, feeling the healing chakra rush to his hands. He localized the chakra over the man's now soaking with blood thigh and pushed every last bit of healing chakra into his hands that he could muster, feeling the pain of his seal increase ever so slightly. He had to make this quick. The man seemed to cringe slightly, but color began to return to his face. The bleeding stopped after a few seconds, and after a few more, it was as if the wound hadn't even existed. If not for the pool of blood that was underneath the man's leg. Naruto disengaged the healing chakra and began to flare his own chakra to get rid of the impurities before he too began to feel the effects. The bar was silent for a little bit before he heard a bit of muted muttering among the other ninja in the bar. A few of them were glancing at him and smirking, while others looked astonished and some even a bit frightened. The wounded man simply looked at him with a mixture of awe, fear, and even a bit of gratitude. While Sasuke was staring at him with barely concealed fervent curiosity, as well as a tinge of jealousy. Naruto simply sighed. He was getting ready to help the man to his feet and then take him to the hospital when he turned around and met the one cyclopean eye of his sensei, replete with orange book and a small saucer of sake. He could only squeak quietly and gape. Sasuke too gaped at the fact that their sensei had just appeared randomly in front of them and seemed to be completely unsurprised and calm about the whole situation. The one-eyed Jounin just stood and leaned on the wall, giving Naruto and Sasuke both a completely deadpan look. If I remember correctly, the first time I came in here, I wounded him even worse than you did. At least I put him in the hospital. Naruto and Sasuke both sweat dropped fiercely and they noticed that a few of the nin behind them laughed quietly. They turned to look at each other incredulously before giving Kakashi a very confused stare. Kakashi chuckled and motioned for them to follow him over to a table, which they both did, Naruto only after he had picked up his sword and forced chakra into it to clean it. They noticed that the man got help to stand from someone who seemed like the manager, and it looked as though that manager was yelling at the man somewhat forcefully, even though the man was simply ignoring it. Naruto was now even more confused than he had been a few moments before. Sitting down, Kakashi took a sip of his sake and put his book away, giving a somewhat perverted stare to a particularly attractive waitress as she passed. I never would have thought you two would show up here, though. People don't usually learn about this place until they hit Chunin. That's not to say that genin aren't allowed, though. Giving Kakashi a completely confused and incredulous stare, Sasuke just quirked his head to the side in a completely un-Sasuke-like way. What exactly is going on here? I would have thought we would be taken in on assault charges or something. I mean, we did wound the guy pretty bad. Kakashi just waved them off with his free hand, taking another sip of his sake. Hardly. That guy picks fights with anyone who's willing. He gets sent to the hospital more often than almost anyone I've ever met. Most people just learn to ignore him. But since you guys have never been here and were a bit too anxious for a fight, Sasuke and Naruto had the decency to look sheepish. He was able to coax a fight out of you pretty easily. Not a bad job, by the way. Naruto had to restrain a smirk and Sasuke didn't restrain it at all. Kakashi just gave them a deadpan look again. Don't misunderstand me. You both need serious work. I'll have to set up a training regimen from now on. How many laps does guy have lead you around Konoha every day? Naruto almost choked on his tongue and Sasuke's eyes went wide. Laps around Konoha. That was absolutely insane. Kakashi I smiled and chuckled. Insane, right? Yeah, guy is kind of like that. Not exactly all there. Speaking of which, here he comes now. Both boys looked to their right to see a green-clad Jounin with a horrendous bowl-cut hairstyle marching towards them with an absolutely blinding smile on his face. Naruto resisted the urge to cringe, while Sasuke simply shuddered. Kakashi noticed the reactions and quietly chuckled again. Guy, apparently, was oblivious to it all. Kakashi, my eternal rival. I find you here once again. I have come to challenge you in a game of. Guy noticed Naruto and Sasuke both giving him a confused and almost frightened look. Even though Guy technically couldn't see Naruto's expression. And quirked an eyebrow. Kakashi, why have you brought two youthful youths to such a hovel as this? They are just genin and you would pollute their minds. Guy by now had a rather comical stern expression adorning his face and Kakashi was simply deadpan once more. Ma, they were here when I got here. Besides, it not like being a ninja isn't mind polluting enough. Sasuke and Naruto both nodded at that bit of sage wisdom, and Guy simply seemed to get even more flustered than he had been before. Luckily for them, he seemed to drop it rather quickly. Kakashi. I challenge you to a drinking contest. If I lose, I shall run 500 laps around Konoha on my hands, and if I cannot accomplish that, I shall carry a boulder back and forth between here and Suna 3 times. Both boys had an absolutely frightened look on their faces at the tasks that the green monster had set before himself. 500 laps. On your hands. Carry a boulder to Suna not once, but 3 times. Naruto was already making to bolt if somehow this guy involved them in any way. There was no way in hell he was doing any of that. Kakashi seemed to be completely ignoring him. You said something. I, apparently, found this to be the worst insult he could be given and proceeded to start crying and shouting things about being hip and rivals. Naruto decided that it was probably a better endeavor simply not to listen to him if at all possible, and apparently Sasuke agreed. Before they could ask Kakashi any more questions, however, a waitress came by, apparently to get their orders. Kakashi looked up and gave the waitress another perverted stare before he seemed to shake himself somewhat. I'll have sake, chilled. Kakashi looked at Naruto and Sasuke both who simply shrugged. I'll have the same. Sasuke just nodded at that, showing that he was of the same mind, and the waitress looked dumbfounded. You too. You're what, 12? Isn't the drinking age like 20? Naruto scowled again, and Sasuke made ready a retort before Kakashi just waved his hand dismissively. They already had that discussion with the bouncer. And he ended up on the floor in a pool of blood. They're old enough to drink. The waitress's eyes widened slightly before she giggled and turned around to fulfill their order. Sasuke smirked and Naruto just chuckled. I think I like this place already. Sasuke nodded at Naruto's opinion, offering up an even wider smirk than he had before. Kakashi simply smiled and glanced at Guy. He had sat down at the table next to Sasuke at some point during their conversation with the waitress. He already had a sake bottle in hand. They sat there in silence for a moment before Naruto realized that there was more they needed to know. Kakashi-sensei. What exactly is this place? Kakashi looked pensive for a moment, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Before he smiled again. This place was set up right after the Second Great Shinobi War. It's been run by the same family the whole time. It's a ninja-only bar. And it's the place that most ninja in Konoha come to relax after missions or just drown their sorrows in sake. Like I said before, most ninjas don't learn about it until they hit Chunin, mostly because they're either old enough to legally drink by then or because genin simply don't ask. The first time I came here was with my sensei after a particularly bad mission. Kakashi chuckled here and even Guy looked amused. The same bouncer that you guys just tore up picked a fight with me. And being that I was young and brash at the time, I responded much like you did, except I left him with a scar running down his chest that you can still see to this day. Put him in the hospital for a week. Guy here left him with a cracked skull the first time he ever came. That guy's been beat up more by people he's picked fights with than anyone else I know. Naruto couldn't help but openly laugh at that, and even Sasuke had an amused smile on his face. Kakashi made him seem like some sort of glorified training post. Perhaps he was. Naruto made a mental note to pick a fight with the guy again at some point. He seemed to be a good stress outlet. Sasuke simply resolved to learn the technique that Naruto used to heal the guy's leg after the fight. He was still very curious about that. Naruto. What was that technique you used to heal that guy's leg? Naruto looked at him for a moment before he shook his head and chuckled. It's a medical technique I learned today. It's sort of a last resort technique that I only use when I absolutely need to. It hurts like hell if I use it too long. Sasuke quirked an eyebrow and nodded. That wasn't exactly the sort of technique he was tremendously interested in. Looking over at Kakashi, he noticed that he was now tremendously interested in staring at another woman who was passing them by, and Guy was apparently ranting on and on about rivalries or spandex or something. He effectively tuned him out of his mind. After a few more moments, their drinks arrived and Naruto removed his mask to sip his chilled sake. Sasuke took this opportunity to study Naruto's face more clearly. His image of Naruto was a blue-eyed whisker-faced blonde with an almost cherubic face and tanned skin. The image of the new Naruto was slightly different. Cleft whisker marks, black eyes, longer face, darker tan. He had seemingly aged a few years overnight. Sasuke scowled inwardly. What on earth could have changed him so fundamentally, so quickly? Naruto noticed Sasuke looking intently at his face and sighed. Kakashi, noticing Naruto's state of discomfort and Sasuke's intense stare, decided that they needed some privacy. He sighed. He supposed he could take one for the team. What say we go over to a different table for our drinking contest? Guy looked over at him astonished for a moment before comprehension dawned on his face, along with his normal idiotic facade. Yosh. Rival, we shall drink until we can no longer stand. I shall beat you yet. Guy stood up, making his normal good guy pose, and walked over to an adjoining table, Kakashi following soon after. He threw a look over at Naruto that clearly said you owe me, before he motioned for the waitress to bring them more sake. Naruto shot him a grateful look before taking a sip of his own sake. A few moments passed before Naruto sighed. You're wondering how I changed, right? Sasuke looked startled for a moment before he tentatively nodded. More than anything, he wondered how Naruto got so strong, but if the story of how he changed was interwoven with that, then he would gladly hear it. Taking another sip, Naruto got a reminiscent look on his face. I'm not really sure what I can and can't. Or rather, what I want and don't want to tell you. But he sighed heavily and maneuvered himself to be more comfortable in his chair, noticing that Sasuke was now tremendously attentive. A few nights ago, I found out a secret about myself that had been kept from me for quite some time. It involved my family and some other things. But it ended up in me finally finding out about my past and about my heritage. Sasuke looked confused before Naruto continued. I ended up inheriting that house you came to. As well as a few other things that my parents left me. Over and above that, my parents left me a basement full of jutsu to learn. That's how I got so strong. That, and the fact that with the amount of chakra I have, I can use Kage Bunshin to speed up my learning process. Whatever a Kage Bunshin learns in its time alive is passed on to the original when he is dispelled. Hence, I have Kage Bunshin train in chakra control, or jutsu, or what have you, and then when I dispel them, I get that training back. Ostensibly, I can train for weeks or months in the space of 1/1000th of that time. As Naruto took another sip of his sake, Sasuke stared at Naruto with an incredulous stare. Kage Bunshin can do that. That's amazing. You could have trained 100 years by the time you're 20 or younger. Sasuke seemed to stare off into space as he mused the possibilities that were open to you with that particular training method. It staggered the mind to think that if you had enough chakra, you could literally speed up your training by years at a time. Naruto smirked and nodded. I'm basically the only person who can do this type of training, however. Seeing as my bloodline is unique to me only. No one, not even the Hokage, has access to the raw amount of chakra that I do. It's something only I can do. I'm sorry. Naruto watched as Sasuke's expression drooped slightly and Naruto couldn't help but cringe. For someone like Sasuke, who craved power so completely, to hear that something like that was simply out of your reach had to be crushing. Sasuke took another sip of his sake as he tried to wrap his mind around the fact that he simply couldn't catch up to Naruto, no matter what he did. Naruto had a training method. A bloodline that simply allowed him to surpass everyone. And Sasuke simply couldn't compete with that. He once again felt the familiar stirrings of jealousy rear their head in his mind and he tried to suppress them as much as he could. And again, this threw everything out the window. Naruto didn't gain power through friendship and bonds, nor did he gain power through anything like he thought he did. He had a bloodline and a technique that gave him power, and that's basically it. Sasuke couldn't help but scowl. It wasn't as if he had been lied to. More that he simply hadn't been told the whole story. He sighed. He was effectively back to square one. Naruto, seeing Sasuke's facial expressions, extrapolated that Sasuke was feeling jealous again. Undoubtedly, his newfound beliefs on true power were being challenged by the fact that Naruto had things that he didn't and could never have. Naruto debated in his head if it was worth it to tell him exactly the price he had to pay for such power. It could change Sasuke's perceptions on everything, or it could make him even more jealous than he was liable to be anyway. He mused for a few seconds before he finally came to a conclusion. Sasuke, wait here for a sec, okay? Sasuke was stirred from his thoughts for only a second before he nodded and Naruto walked over to the table where Kakashi was downing sake like it was going out of style. Kakashi, seeing Naruto's approach, put down his sake bottle and turned his gaze to the blonde, giving him a questioning glance with his one eye. Kakashi-sensei. Could you do that privacy jutsu thing on my table? Naruto had come to the decision that if anyone was to know, Sasuke probably should. It would either be the biggest mistake of his life or the greatest triumph. Either way, he wanted to get it out of the way. Kakashi's eye widened considerably and even Guy looked serious. Naruto. Are you sure? You want to tell him? Kakashi looked genuinely concerned for Naruto and Naruto couldn't help but smile slightly. He just nodded and Kakashi's eye drooped slightly before he too nodded his consent. With a few hand seals, Kakashi performed a jutsu and then put his hand on the ground. A small, almost unseen tendril of chakra made its way over to his table and after a few seconds, the jinjutsu, or whatever it was complete. Nodding to Kakashi, he walked back to his own table, bracing himself to tell Sasuke one of his biggest secrets. When he got back to the table, Sasuke was still musing on something that Naruto didn't quite need to know about. With another sigh and sip of sake, he cleared his throat to get Sasuke's attention. When he looked up at him, he lowered his own eyes and mentally shook himself of doubt. Sasuke. Not everything I told you about myself was entirely true. You have to understand that. Well. He braced himself and tried to find the right words as Sasuke quirked an eyebrow at him, coinciding with the start of a scowl. Naruto sighed again and took a quick glug of confidence from his sake bottle. What I'm about to tell you is one of the village's most well-kept S-class secrets. What I tell you tonight can be told to no one outside of those who already know. I need to know that you understand this before I go on. Sasuke's eyes widened considerably and after a few moments, he nodded tentatively. Naruto shifted his eyes to the ground and closed them for a second, gathering his thoughts before he plunged into the description. 12 years ago, the Yondaime Hokage defeated the Kyuubi no Kitsune, saving the village of Konoha and all its inhabitants from a grisly and untimely death. To do this, he gave up his life, using a jutsu known as Shiki Fusion to kill the beast and end the threat of the Kyuubi forever. He paused slightly, seeing Sasuke's eyes widen even more. However, what the younger generation knows about the Kyuubi is somewhat false. In the academy, they teach us that the Kyuubi was killed by the Yondaime. And this is not true. Rather, the Kyuubi could not be killed. She was a greater demon at the time, and no mortal could kill her without completely destroying her demonic side first. Instead, the Yondaime sealed her. Not into any object. No inanimate object could hold the Kyuubi without the seal breaking. He was forced to seal her into a newborn baby. He paused again, seeing that Sasuke's eyes were now as wide as they could possibly be, and his hand was shaking ever so slightly. He sighed again. Sasuke. I was that newborn baby. I am the container for the Kyuubi no Kitsune. For a moment, everything seemed to be silent. The sounds of the bar didn't reach Naruto's ears, the sight of Kakashi giving him concerned glances didn't faze him, and even the relatively blank yet fearful and astonished gaze of Sasuke didn't trouble him. He waited with bated breath as Sasuke processed the information he had just given him. Sasuke would hate him, fear him, shun him. Or maybe. Just maybe. That explains a lot. It really does. Sasuke paused for a moment before he raised his eyes once more, this time, they were narrowed more, but they held no malice. Naruto allowed his hopes to get up that maybe Sasuke wouldn't hate him or fear him or shun him. That maybe Sasuke would understand, that Sasuke would be one of the few that he could trust. That's why you're looked at with hate and loathing, isn't it? Why people don't like you. Why the people at the academy always picked on you. Why you live alone. Because. People see you as the Kyuubi, don't they? They don't see Naruto at all. They just see. Wait. Kyuubi is a her. Naruto couldn't help but sweat drop. And then laugh. He really laughed. Sasuke didn't hate him. At least, he didn't think he did. Sasuke accepted him, or at the very least, he understood. The first person from his generation that he had told about the Kyuubi had actually understood what he had gone through. What he had endured. He laughed until tears came out of his eyes. It was a hell of a weight to hold, not knowing if someone would judge you for something you didn't do. He wasn't sure if he was happy, confused or just plain relieved. But whatever it was, it felt good. He noticed that after a while, Sasuke gave him a confused glance. Naruto tried his best to contain his laughter, but no matter what he did, he couldn't keep the smile off of his face. Sorry. Ha. I guess. I just thought you might hate me like everyone else does. I'm relieved and more than a little bit happy. Sorry. Didn't mean to confuse you. Sasuke quirked an eyebrow at him before he smirked. Why on earth would I hate you for something like that? If I hate you, it's because you're annoying, loud, and your hair irritates me. Naruto's smile changed to an amused scowl almost instantly. My hair? I'm not the one with a duck's ass glued to my head. Having blonde hair like mine is distinguished. Yours is just. Emo. Sasuke's smirk changed to his own version of an amused scowl, and his eyebrow twitched ever so slightly. Naruto couldn't help but have the corners of his mouth quirk into a bit of a smile, and Sasuke's own mouth curved upward ever so slightly. After a few seconds, both boys couldn't help but laugh again. The effects of the sake, the stress, the relief and perhaps even the beginning of a bond being too much for them to take. Minutes passed in silence as Naruto felt the privacy screen drop around them. Kakashi gave him a warm smile, and even Guy looked to be relieved. They had undoubtedly seen the two laughing together. Naruto sent Kakashi another grateful stare before he turned his attention back to Sasuke. He took another sip of confidence from his bottle and then sighed. There's more to it than that. But for now, that's all I can really tell you. I hope that it clears a few things up for you. For the power I have. I had to pay a price. And I had no choice in the matter. I'm just making the best of a bad situation. Naruto's mood sobered and he considered telling Sasuke about his mother's own heritage but decided against it for the moment. The moment for that would come soon enough. Sasuke's own face sobered considerably and he nodded. You'll tell me if you want to, I guess. I'm not sure if I could have taken something like that and still turn out as relatively sane as you did. It doesn't stop me from still being a little jealous. But I can certainly understand more now than I did before. Naruto grinned and took another sip of his sake. He looked at the table and couldn't help but sigh in relief once more. It felt good to have a weight like that off his shoulders. Sasuke accepted him. He may not accept the fact that he still couldn't train like him. But nonetheless, at least, Sasuke understood. At the moment, that's all that mattered. He then remembered his original offer of training. He scrunched his face up and thought for a moment before an idea hit him. Sasuke. We can still train together. I'll obviously be training at a faster pace. But if you want, we can combine our efforts. It has to be better than training alone, right? Besides, Kyuubi can teach you a few things. Sasuke looked up, startled. Wait. Kyuubi is teaching you? How in the hell did that happen? Naruto just snickered. It's a long story. I'll tell you sometime, but suffice it to say that she's not as evil as you might think. You might think it's morbidly funny, but the whole situation was just a result of teenage rebellion, really. Hearing this, Kyuubi bit his shoulder rather forcefully, earning her a glower from Naruto. Seeing this interaction, Sasuke raised both eyebrows, but said nothing for the moment. If they were going to be training together anyway, the information would be forthcoming at some point. Instead, he just sighed. I suppose we could train together. If Kyuubi is a good enough sensei to make a good ninja out of someone like you, then she could do wonders for a ninja like me. Naruto glared at Sasuke forcefully for a moment before he smirked. Sasuke smiled for a moment before taking another sip of his sake. It felt normal again. Naruto felt the same way. They were bantering back and forth like old friends, insulting each other, but putting no malice or bad vibes behind it whatsoever. Naruto, at that moment, realized that they didn't really need to have some overdramatic talk on bonds and friendship and other such things. Rather, they simply needed to understand and acknowledge each other. It wouldn't be easy. But perhaps, it wouldn't be hard either. Both Genin watched as Kakashi downed bottles of sake without removing his mask, seemingly oblivious to the effects the alcohol should have been having on him. Guy, on the other hand, was barely sitting up straight, his eyes half drooped and his speech all but unintelligible. Naruto couldn't help but laugh. It seemed as though Guy would be running those laps around Konoha after all. He made a mental note to get Kakashi to teach him how to eat and drink without removing his mask. After a while, Naruto began to feel the effects of the sake more forcefully, and utilizing what little part of his brain wasn't affected by the alcohol, he decided to call it a night. He motioned to Sasuke that he was leaving, and to his slight surprise, Sasuke too looked as though he was about ready to leave. Both Genin bade their sensei farewell and began walking home. Curiously enough, in the same direction. After a while, they got to the intersection where Sasuke would have to part ways. Sasuke paused for a moment before he sighed and looked at Naruto with a blank expression. Tomorrow. We start training tomorrow. Naruto quirked an eyebrow behind his mask, but nodded. Sasuke too just nodded and turned to walk away, waving his hand slightly while putting his other hand in his pocket. Naruto smiled. It wasn't exactly a deep familial bond. Yet. But it would get there. Eventually. Naruto would be able to call Sasuke a friend and family as well. He turned and made his way up the road to his own house, a smile on his face the whole way. The shadowed figure walked into a dimly lit room, flanked on either side by what looked like Anbu. He sat down and cleared his throat, gaining the attention of the other occupant of the room. It is as you suspected, Taichu. The larger figure behind the desk seemed to smirk slightly. Excellent. This makes things so much easier. I surmise that you have already told him. The smaller figure nodded. He has been appraised, Taichu. I imagine that he is of the same mind as you are. The larger figure just nodded and sighed before taking a drag off of his pipe. No matter his goals, he is simply a pawn in the grand scheme of things. Remember your own loyalties first, Kabuto. The Budo nodded again, his expressionless face caught in the glow of the now glowing embers of the man's pipe. My loyalties are as solid as the great tree itself, Taichu. The larger figure chuckled darkly. I know they are, Kabuto. You have not failed me yet and I do not expect that you ever will. Continue with your surveillance procedures and report to me daily. See to it that you keep your other superior in the dark as much as possible. The Budo nodded again before getting up and leaving the room, flanked yet again by his two Anbu escorts. The larger figure behind the desk smirked once more. Naruto could use the Kyuubi at will. Konoha's little weapon was becoming even more powerful than they had thought. He took another drag off of his pipe and took out another report on the current status of the hidden village of sound. What will you do? Orochimaru? I have moved my piece. Where shall you move yours? The figure cackled softly, watching as the light in the room shifted slightly. His other operative had arrived. Shadow Kabuto. He means to betray me. The shadowed figure that had entered the room nodded and departed just as quickly, off to find his target. The large figure smirked again. Once he had Naruto. Nothing could stop him. She restrained herself from thinking of just what Konoha had been missing out on. It would do no good to dwell on the past. For now, all she could do was marvel at Naruto's sheer tenacity when it came to training. As well as his outright astronomical improvement over the past month. Even with the impression seal. If Konoha had trained Naruto. If they had really focused. He would have been a power the likes of which hadn't been seen since the Yondaime himself by the time he was 18. As it was, in only about a month's time, he had come so far, so fast. It was staggering. He was a completely different person. Personality, knowledge, power, prestige. Naruto had surpassed each and every single expectation Kyuubi had had for him, and then some. It was truly a mindfucker. Sasuke, too. After a bit of getting used to it. Had come a long way. His first reaction to seeing Kyuubi's human form. Especially after seeing the little fox kid he thought was just a pet transform. Had been nothing short of comical. He had literally just gaped at her for a few minutes before he had thrown a flurry of questions at Naruto that they had spent the better part of a day answering. Or not answering as it were. After his bout of confusion had been taken care of however, he had set himself to training so hard that Kyuubi had wondered if perhaps the boy wasn't pushing himself a bit too hard. Of course, when she had asked this, Sasuke had all but blown up at her, telling her that there was absolutely no way that he would allow himself to do anything but train to his limits. She had smirked at this, especially after he had all but killed himself doing the same physical conditioning that Naruto went through. Unfortunately for him, however, he didn't have the benefit of Kyuubi's chakra. He had been forced to go through the trouble of obtaining weights for himself, seeing as how it was impossible for him not to atrophy. Well, it had slowed him down. And on more than one occasion, injured him. In the end, it had proved very fruitful. He was much faster, much more agile, and slightly more bulky than he had been before. She almost giggled at that last part. If anything, it had served to endear him even further to his fangirl base. It seemed as though he simply couldn't catch a break. Both boys had simply been able to absorb jutsu after jutsu at a staggering pace. After Sasuke had all but broken into the Uchiha jutsu vault, he had been training more jutsu than even Naruto had. At least, at first. Sasuke probably knew more fire jutsu than anyone else his age at this point, although Naruto would quickly catch up at some point. Naruto had focused more on learning the nature of his chakra first, as opposed to simply learning jutsu as he went along. Asuma's scroll, coupled with Kakashi's own small amount of tutelage, had allowed him to learn earth, wind and fire natures rather quickly, with the help of Kage Bunshin. And while he most certainly wasn't a master of any of them yet, he had enough proficiency in them to learn at least B-ranked elemental jutsu, if not A with a little more effort. What surprised her most, however, was the fact that Naruto had been advancing in Ryudo very quickly. Considering that Ryudo was basically the only thing he couldn't train with Kage Bunshin, his progress was simply unprecedented. He still trained his chakra field with Kage Bunshin, but movements within Ryudo couldn't be trained by anything but the original. Seeing as how the user needed to commit the movements to muscle memory. A purely physical attribute. If anything, Naruto had improved on the style. While most times, Ryudo was used as simply a means to move around your opponent and strike quickly and quietly, Naruto had shown that it could be used for simply brute force attacking as well. You could charge your opponent quickly, maneuver your legs and expel chakra, and become some sort of a whirling dervish at close range. Ryudo allowed the user, in Naruto's case anyway, to move quickly, quietly, viciously and with strong purposeful attacks. It was suited both for ambush and for grouped fighting. And Naruto had shown that its versatility knew no bounds. Against Kyuubi's wishes, however, he had also studied more about sword style, along with the Ryudo itself. He hadn't trained kata or even a particular style of sword fighting. Rather, he had learned the most efficient movements one could make with a sword and the general ways that swordsmen moved. He had then adapted this knowledge directly to fighting within the flow itself, allowing him to be a true swordsman, while at the same time, moving like a ninja. Kyuubi had been forced to admit to herself that the Ryudo with style was vastly superior to the Ryudo without style. And with the way Naruto was using Ryudo, it came as no surprise that he had been able to combine everything together to form it into a devastating style of sword movement that was sure to decimate any enemy he came across. Assuming that said enemy wasn't simply faster than he was. Jutsu-wise, however, he was lacking. At least compared to his training partner. Over and above the 3 jutsu he had learned earlier in the month, he had only learned 2 more. His reasoning had been that once he learned the nature of his chakra, the jutsu he learned would be that much more powerful, not to mention much easier to learn. While this was undoubtedly true, learning the natures of his chakra had taken up quite a bit of time, and he had only really had the time to learn 2 more jutsu during his training. One of them, Kyuubi had found to be very interesting. It was a jutsu that allowed the user to use Kage Bunshin as it related to weaponry. Specifically, shuriken and kunai. The jutsu itself was known simply as Shuriken Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, however, after some experimentation, they had found that it worked with just about any weapon they could get their hands on, assuming you had enough chakra to actually multiply them. It was a tremendously useful jutsu, and Kyuubi had been left wondering if perhaps it would work on grenades just as well. The second jutsu he had learned had been the Bakuretsu Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Or rather, a version of it. The real Bakuretsu Kage Bunshin no Jutsu used hand seals to cause the chakra in a Kage Bunshin to remotely detonate, effectively creating a kamikaze Kage Bunshin. This required very precise chakra control, however. And Naruto simply wasn't at the level where his control was enough to use the jutsu. Instead, he found that if he pumped enough chakra into an already made Kage Bunshin and then sent it on its way, he could simply allow the Kage Bunshin's consciousness give the order to detonate itself as soon as it reached its goal. It wasn't perfect. But it was the best he could do. The only benefit that it had, however, was that the explosions were of a magnitude far greater than that of a regular Bakuretsu Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Simply due to the fact that there was more chakra in his version. He had also learned much more about anatomy than he had known before. He was at the point, medically speaking, where he could probably mend bones without having to use her chakra to do so. This had been evidenced by the fact that every time Sasuke injured himself, Naruto had been able to effectively heal him up to the point where he could continue training. Sasuke had still had to go to the hospital a number of times. But, if anything, Sasuke had been a very effective guinea pig for Naruto's medical abilities. It wasn't exactly as if Sasuke was complaining. Naruto's ability to heal him had sped up his training by a fair pace, and Kyuubi had noticed that Sasuke didn't worry one bit about getting injured while training anymore. Naruto had also set up an impromptu chemistry lab in the infamous basement of his house, prompting both Kakashi and the Hokage to have a small conniption fit. They had argued heavily against the idea. Citing that if he were to somehow mess up and blow himself to smithereens, that all of the knowledge that the basement contained would be taken with it. Naruto had assuaged their fears by completely redesigning the layout of the basement, separating his chemistry lab and the jutsu cabinets from one another by a rather effective firewall. This hadn't exactly gone over completely well with Kakashi and the Hokage. This being because they both didn't exactly want to see Naruto blown to smithereens either. But Naruto had simply put his foot down, and there had been nothing either of them had been able to do about it. As it was, they had been able to produce 5 completed grenades in the space of 1 month. It had taken a lot of investigating and outright footwork to gather the materials that Naruto had needed to make them, but by the end, he had amassed a small stockpile of munitions-grade components. Probably enough to make a few hundred grenades. The materials for the aptly named flashbang had been something they hadn't even delved into. It had been hard enough to acquire the materials for simple grenades. They both figured that at some point they'd be able to acquire them. But they didn't see it as a priority. Over and above all of his accomplishments, however, he had still been unable to master the Rasengan. He had the second stage, as it were, completely mastered. However, controlling it in its third stage had proven to be all but impossible. Kyuubi and Naruto both had tried everything short of completely unsealing the Shiki Fuijin to try to get her chakra to stop interfering with his own. But none of it seemed to work. They had theories that if enough suppression seals were released, the problem would be taken care of. But as it was, he was taking about as much of her chakra as he could handle. Naruto had resigned himself to the fact that the Rasengan was simply out of his reach at this point. Although, Kyuubi had seen him on more than one occasion thinking about ways to master it. Sasuke, on the other hand, had taken a much different route in his own training. He had focused almost completely on fire jutsu, physical conditioning and taijutsu to the exclusion of almost everything else. He had expressed a lot of interest in learning the Ryudo, but hearing that it took more chakra than he was able to produce had dampened his desire somewhat. Instead, he had learned a very Sharingan-centric form of taijutsu that he had found in the Uchiha vaults. Even though he didn't yet possess the bloodline. His reasoning had been that he wanted to be well versed in it before he activated the Sharingan, and Kyuubi had been forced to agree. He was rather effective with the style, even without the bloodline active, and she wondered just how good he would be once he gained the famous Mirror Lie. All of this brought up a problem that Kyuubi had found somewhat recently in Naruto's own training. Using the Ryudo, the user could move at tremendously fast speeds. However, the human eye was only so fast itself. Kyuubi had never had a problem with it, seeing as how her eyes were most definitely not human. And her sensei had always been able to simply discern his surroundings by using his chakra to create images in his mind, not unlike radar. Naruto, on the other hand, did not have the chakra control necessary to project a radar, nor did he have Kyuubi's eyes. They had both settled on the fact that he would have to move at a set slower pace of Ryudo until he activated his Sharingan, which would undoubtedly allow him to see much better while going at much higher speeds. Naruto also now had his enhanced senses activated all the time. Kyuubi had drilled into him the importance of being aware of your surroundings in every possible way, and so they had trained to make sure that he was able to keep his senses alert and active at all times so as to be aware of attackers, ambushers, and just being able to track at a moment's notice. It had definitely taken some getting used to on Naruto's part, but he had eventually been able to simply do it without thinking about it much. His progress on both hand seals and blood seals had been producing rapid results as well. He was well versed at this point in the purpose of hand seals in general and had a general knowledge of what each one did. Blood seals were a bit harder, considering that they required memorization of certain runic combinations as well as a knowledge of seal arrays and how they worked. But considering that he had Kyuubi looking over his shoulder as it were made it much easier. Her knowledge of seals was very thorough and it had allowed Naruto to learn about blood seals much more quickly than usual. For all of this though, there was a price. His social life. For the past month, he had seen neither hide nor hair of Hinata or even Tenten, although not seeing Tenten was for a good reason. In preparation for the Chunin exams, Guy had been training them almost non-stop, as well as taking them on quite a few C-rank missions. Any free time that Tenten had was spent either sleeping, eating, or at her family's shop, and she apparently hadn't had any opportunities to spend time with Naruto, except for a few times when they had seen each other at Ichiraku Ramen. Hinata, on the other hand, was a bit confusing. Naruto, on several occasions, had invited Hinata over for tea or just conversation, and even once, had invited her for a spar. However, she had declined all of them politely, citing prior engagements or sickness or various other excuses that Kyuubi had found all too convenient. Naruto had even talked to Hiashi on the matter briefly, but he had not been forthcoming with answers, simply because he too was baffled. All parties involved had simply made the decision to back off as it were from pressing Hinata about it. They figured that she would come around at some point, they just didn't know when or how. The most incredible change in general, however, was the fact that Naruto's reputation in the village had begun to change seemingly overnight after the Hyuga dinner, both with the civilian population and the ninja population. Once word had spread that the Hyuga Hiashi had invited that boy over for a private dinner, people had begun to question their beliefs on the subject of the demon boy. The civilian population's general opinion of Naruto rose considerably. Even if it still left him in deficit. The ninja's opinion of him, however, was not that influenced by the fact that he was now all but nobility. Instead, the shinobi population seemed to be impressed that he and the Uchiha heir had both started and finished a bar fight at the infamous shinobi-only bar that seemingly had no name. It seemed to be almost a rite of passage to most ninja, and the fact that they had passed it at such a young age was something that apparently garnered them both respect. Neither Naruto nor Sasuke had been back to the bar since. However, they had heard from Kakashi that they were very much welcome any time. Kyuubi sat in the training grounds, watching as the sun set slowly in the west, while Naruto was finishing up working on the Ryudo. Sasuke was currently catching his breath off to the side after working on his taijutsu. She smiled. It was peaceful, if not a bit hectic. Sasuke hadn't turned out to be quite the asshole that Naruto had portrayed him to be. He had actually been polite and sociable to her on more than one occasion. Naruto too had seemed to mature greatly over the last month, becoming less and less the old Naruto as time passed. She had various theories on exactly what caused this transformation. But none of them involved anything malicious. The most probable theory was that the Kage Bunshin's mental fatigue on his mind had forced him to mature prematurely. If the training was being done weeks at a time in the space of days, then perhaps his mind was maturing just as quickly. She had wondered just what this could mean, but she had also noticed that no matter how much he had matured, the Naruto that she knew and respected still dwelled in his husk. As long as he didn't become a power-obsessed madman, she was okay with however he grew up. She mused over this for a moment before allowing herself a small chuckle. Growing up seemed to be something that Sakura simply wasn't doing. Even after she had heard about Naruto and Sasuke's training regimen together, she had still maintained Sasuke's superiority, even over Sasuke's frank admissions to the contrary. Kyuubi had a feeling that Sakura didn't really believe what she was saying, nor did she really put any heart into it. But rather, she wanted to be acknowledged by Sasuke in the worst way. The fact that Sasuke only acknowledged a few people, including Naruto, seemed to both infuriate and depress her at the same time. At the very least, however, she was back on speaking terms with Naruto, and the two had gotten back into a relationship that resembled, at least somewhat, the relationship they had had before. Sakura would dote on Sasuke, Sasuke would ignore Sakura, Naruto would ignore Sakura, Sakura would insult Naruto, Naruto would ignore Sakura. It went on and on and on, and if anyone asked Kyuubi, it was simply boring. Kyuubi realized that during her musings, Naruto had finished his Ryudo training and Sasuke too had caught his breath. All three saw the sun slowly setting in the west, an event that usually marked the end of their sessions. Sasuke got up and nodded to Naruto slightly before he began to walk off, and Naruto returned the nod just before he fell down onto his butt and started heaving to catch his breath. Kyuubi too got up and after exchanging polite adieus with Sasuke, made her way over to Naruto. She kneeled down beside him with a smirk. Pushed yourself rather hard there at the end, didn't you? That didn't have anything to do with me kicking your butt in Ryudo again, did it? Naruto gave her a pointed scowl, his mask laid aside for the moment so he could gulp down copious amounts of water. You can see while you're moving in the flow, I can't. Besides, you've been at this for how long? Of course I'm not going to catch up to an old woman in experience. The vein bulged on Kyuubi's forehead. A curious occurrence seeing as how she technically didn't have blood vessels. Old woman. You think I'm simply some old woman, just wait until training tomorrow, I'll show you what this old woman can do. She huffed and crossed her arms over her chest, snubbing Naruto completely. Naruto just smirked and went back to drinking his water. He knew exactly which buttons to push in Kyuubi to get her riled up. And she knew exactly which buttons to push in him as well. It was a strange relationship they shared, that was for certain. If anyone saw them, they might think them a married couple or something. Naruto just laughed. Married? With Kyuubi? The idea in and of itself was laughable. The two sat there in companionable silence for a few minutes before Naruto's breathing finally calmed down enough for him to think about moving. With a grunt, he pushed himself up and offered a hand up to Kyuubi, who took it without complaint. If Kyuubi was good for anything, she had taught him at least somewhat about how to act as a gentleman should. Considering how much Kyuubi had done for him, it was the least he could do. Naruto walked not back into the house, but into the onsen, where he usually took his after-training soak. It helped his muscles and entire body simply relax, and it was one of the few pleasures, aside from ramen and sake, that he allowed himself. Taking off his various articles of clothing and weaponry, he stepped into the warm and inviting water, feeling the water soak into his pores and loosen his tense muscles. He grinned and rested his head on the stone edge, closing his eyes in the process. If there was a heaven, this had to be it. His thought subconsciously drifted to the progress he had made in the past month. He had made great strides towards improving his skills, that much he would admit freely. But he still felt as though he was simply using borrowed power. He had struck upon that epiphany earlier in the month, realizing that none of this training would have been possible without help from Kyuubi. It had dampened his spirit somewhat. The thought that his power came from something other than himself was a bit disheartening in the fact that if he didn't have the Kyuubi, he would probably be much less powerful than he was now. He tempered this however, with the knowledge that if he didn't have the Kyuubi, undoubtedly, someone else would. He had no idea what it was like to be without the Kyuubi. As he had simply lived with her for all of his life, even if he hadn't known about it for the majority of it. He had always healed quickly, always had freakish stamina, always lived with the stigma. So in a sense, he couldn't imagine what life would be like if he didn't possess the Kyuubi within him. He had thought that perhaps he was simply overthinking it. But he wondered. What would life be like if he had never been a Jinchuriki? He forced these somewhat depressing thoughts out of his mind, preferring to focus on the absolute bliss that he was currently experiencing. His joints were popping back into proper alignment, his muscles were like jelly, his mind was free and clear, and his body felt the rush of endorphins that one usually got after training. Life was good, he decided. Whether or not he had the Kyuubi, or whether he was a pariah within Konoha at this very moment mattered not. What mattered was that he was here now, and that he was well on his way to his goal. He smiled. Dwelling on the past inevitably dampened the future. After a few more minutes of blissful relaxation, he realized that there was a slight rumbling sound emanating from his midsection. He nearly frowned. His body was hungry. He supposed it was to be expected. After so much hard work, even with the Kyuubi's chakra supplementing his strength, he would still require nourishment. Besides, he hadn't been to Ichiraku for almost a week. And they were probably frantic to see him, considering that he was their largest source of income. With an exaggerated sigh, he pulled himself from the warm water and put a towel on, trudging back inside. Kyuubi was still in her human form, napping quietly on the couch. Naruto smiled at the sight of it. She looked cute like that. Every once in a while her foot would twitch spasmodically and her mouth would curve. And Naruto chuckled heartily when she muttered something about a rabbit and morsel in the same sentence. He filed that away to use as future blackmail material. He trudged upstairs and donned his usual attire before exiting the house as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake Kyuubi. After all, she needed her sleep just as much as he did, and she had been working probably as hard as he was. She had been training frantically to increase the amount of chakra she could hold, and she had even been studying various books they had found so that she could work on a way of making herself an actual body. So far, all she had been able to discern is that she needed an equal amount of fleshy material to the relative size of the body to be created. It had been a bit disheartening to learn that they needed such a thing to recreate her body. But they had decided that at some point they would be able to do it. They just needed more information. Naruto began his trek towards Ichiraku slowly, hands in his pockets and his gait relaxed. With his newfound skill, he had very much relaxed while traveling within Konoha, confident that if a situation where someone attacked him arose, he would be able to take care of it. The probability of him being attacked by ninja was very small, and considering that most civilians, the group that hated him the most, were unskilled, meant that he didn't really worry about not being able to beat them or just outrun them. Essentially, he no longer needed to worry about it. It had been a very large weight off of his shoulders to realize this. Along the way, he noticed that the shinobi were nodding to him as they passed. This confused him until he remembered that most of the shinobi were able to discern who people were behind masks. And he had a bit of a reputation among the shinobi of Konoha. He was the Kyuubi kid who wore the white mask. Undoubtedly, he stood out, at least to those who knew what to look for. The civilian population was only slowly starting to catch on that the demon brat had taken on a new look. Considering that he still had to take his mask off to eat or drink meant that every once in a while, people would catch him without his mask on. This led to a few rumors regarding him, but they hadn't carried any credence until only recently. People were just beginning to realize who he was behind the mask, and while this unnerved him slightly, it also caused him to smirk sometimes. He didn't care if they knew who he was anymore. They couldn't hurt him. After a few more minutes of walking, he managed to make it to Ichiraku Ramen without incident. There were only a few people sitting there, none of them shinobi. He nearly scowled. If he took off his mask to eat there, it would mean that people would see who he was. He didn't much care that others knew, but it also meant that the old man would lose customers. He had witnessed when people insulted him before when he was at the ramen stand, and the old man had ejected them unceremoniously without any hesitation. It had always bothered Naruto that old man Ichiraku lost business on account of him, and on more than one occasion, he wondered if perhaps it wasn't better that he simply didn't eat there, for that reason alone. He had voiced his opinion to the old man once, and he had been surprised at the seriousness and depth of the response he had gotten. At the time, he hadn't known of the Kyuubi, so his words hadn't meant as much. But now, reflecting back on it, he knew how much it meant to him. The old man had simply looked him in the eyes and said, if they're the type of person to hate you just for being you, then I don't want their business. It's as simple as that. Unknowingly, the old man had been one of the first people to acknowledge him for being simply Naruto. It had endeared him to them for life, and now that he knew about the Kyuubi, it only strengthened that feeling. The Ichirakus were easily some of his most precious people in the entirety of the village. This didn't stop the feeling of guilt from them losing business. But it did help. He supposed that in the end, it wasn't his decision. The Ichirakus loved the business he did give them, and he probably made up for at least some of the people that wouldn't eat there because that demon brat ate there. He smiled sadly. It was the only rationalization he could come up with. Drifting from his thoughts, he walked up to the stand and plopped himself down in the middle seat. Oi Aji. 10 bowls of the usual. Said Aji looked up from where he was making noodles and saw Naruto before he smiled. Mizo, right. Coming right up. Naruto just nodded before he saw the old man go into the back to get more supplies. He caught a glance of Am chopping up vegetables before she vanished from his sight, probably to help her father to gather materials. He simply smiled. It happened every time. They always had to go into the storeroom to get more ingredients when he came to the stand, considering that he rarely left before eating at least 15 bowls of ramen. He was hungry enough tonight that he was pretty sure he could eat 20. After a few more minutes of waiting, 10 piping hot bowls of ramen were placed in front of him. He smiled and unlatched his mask, causing a few of the patrons around him to stare at him warily. He simply ignored them. With his smile firmly in place, he muttered a subdued itadakimasu and dug in fervently. While he was busy in the thralls of ramen nirvana, a few of the patrons of the stand looked at him with barely concealed disgust. They were 3 men with nondescript faces and clothing, each of them looking to the normal eye as civilians. They quickly schooled themselves into an impassive expression and paid their fee before either Naruto or the old man could notice and made their way down the street. Unseen to anyone, they ducked into an alleyway to wait. Naruto was simply enjoying his ramen, relatively oblivious to the rest of the world. He had noticed some very faint killing intent being radiated off of the men who sat to his left, but considering that they had already left, he let it drift out of his mind. He had long ago gotten used to such things. He smirked. The killing intent had been incredibly weak anyway. He was sure that he had felt more from Sakura than from those men, and that was indeed saying something. After ordering another 10 bowls and summarily downing them with fervor, he sighed contentedly. Ramen truly was his one true vice. Sake, women, drugs, tobacco. Nothing would ever be as alluring and addictive to him than those succulent and juicy noodles. The meat and the spices. It was a nirvana that he was too deep in to pull out from. He would forever be embroiled in the throes of his ramen addiction. He slapped down some money on the counter and made to leave before he noticed that the old man wasn't at the counter anymore. The other customers of the stand had long past gotten through with their own respective meals, and he figured that Tucci was simply cleaning something in the back or something. It certainly wasn't uncommon. Nevertheless, something nagged him. Oi, Aji, that was great. Thanks for the ramen, as always. He said it a bit louder than usual, seeing as how he was aiming to get a reaction or a response from the old man before he left. After a few moments, he saw Tucci peek his head out and give Naruto a disarming smile before he walked up to the counter and took Naruto's money. Naruto just smiled and reattached his mask before he made his way to leave the stand when he heard the old man behind him clear his throat loudly. Naruto turned back to him, wondering just what he could have wanted. He had paid the amount necessary for the ramen. And even left a tip. As Naruto's head quirked to the side inquisitively, the old man sighed and scratched the back of his head. Naruto, I hate to ask you this, but would it be possible for you to walk AM home tonight? She's apparently coming down with something, and I don't want her getting any sicker or spreading whatever it is to more people. I have to keep the stand open for a few more hours, or I would do it myself. Naruto just smiled behind his mask. He had, in the past, walked AM home so that she could work on a way of making herself, as he began to tea on several occasions. When he was younger, it was so that AM would be able to protect Naruto, at least somewhat, during the trek between the stand and their house, which was on the way to his own apartment. In the past few years, however, the roles had reversed, with Naruto being a ninja in training. And therefore much more capable of protecting both himself and AM if necessary. The old man hadn't asked him to walk her daughter home for almost 6 months though. He owed them this much at the very least. Absolutely. It's the least I can do. Naruto's smile behind his mask widened at seeing Tucci's relieved expression. Naruto strode to the side entrance of the stand and waited for the old man to unlock the door, and after a few moments, a slightly sick-looking AM came out of the stand. Her face was a bit pale, and it looked as if she was sweating slightly. Naruto immediately allowed her to lean on his shoulder. AM smiled down at Naruto kindly. They had grown quite close over the years, very much like brother and sister. Naruto had even gotten a brother complex over AM, being rather protective of the girl as of late. He had even threatened one of her boyfriends once that if he hurt her in any way, he would have to deal with him. And coming from the Kyuubi brat, it had apparently meant quite a bit. Fortunately or unfortunately, it had also completely scared him away from the girl, which she had berated him for weeks for. Thanks, Naruto-kun. It's probably just this cold that's going around. A few days of bed rest should clear it up. Naruto just nodded his head and began walking in the general direction of the Ichiraku residence, AM holding herself steady on his shoulder. They walked at a slow pace towards the more residential district of Konoha, all the while chatting about inane things like the weather and how Naruto's training was going, which he obliged to talk about only in the most general of terms, not wanting to have AM go into sister mode and dote over him for working too hard. After a while, Naruto noticed that something was up. He had picked up 3 distinct smells that had been following them at a longer distance, and he could feel a very weak killing intent being projected at him from behind. AM, apparently, was oblivious to it, but Naruto immediately changed his demeanor and set his emotions in check, ready to run or fight at a moment's notice. Seeing as how he had a sick AM with him, he guessed that he would have to fight. Without alerting anyone or upsetting his surrogate sister, he lowered his hand to just above his kunai pouch and put his other hand behind his head in what was typical Naruto fashion. But it put his hand much closer to the hilt of his sword for a quick draw if he needed. He also began to gather chakra to form the chakra field for Ryudo, just in case his opponents turned out to be ninja. He had only been attacked once in his life by ninja, but it really didn't hurt to be prepared. He noticed with a grimace that the 3 smells had gotten closer. He could now also smell a steady scent of booze wafting in his nostrils, but he was now having a bit of trouble differentiating between those simply traversing the street and the 3 who were following him. He was in a bad situation. If someone attacked him while he was in the middle of the street, it was possible that more people would join in. And it was also possible that ninja could get involved. It wouldn't be the first time that his mere presence had started a mini riot. He mulled over his options for a moment before he let a resigned sigh slip his lips. He didn't want to take the chance that any more people than necessary would get involved. He glanced up at AM and gave her hand a squeeze to break her from her own musings before he gave her an apologetic glance. Which she couldn't see behind his mask. With a sweeping motion, he put AM into his arm's bridle style, earning him a surprise deep. For his troubles. He took to the roof and made his way to an alley a few hundred yards down the road, putting his back to the dead end. He set down a thoroughly confused AM behind him and turned back towards the opening of the alley, his sword hand hovering just above his sword's hilt. He contemplated for a moment that he could simply outrun the men, but quickly thought better of it. Well, he could certainly outrun the men. Once he had dropped off AM, there would be nothing to stop them from assailing her at her house instead of dealing with him directly. He wanted to take these three out here and now if at all possible, mostly because he didn't want to drag his sister into this if he could avoid it. He waited with bated breath for the three to arrive. He wasn't disappointed. After a few minutes, three obviously drunk men made their way into the alley, lecherous and downright drunk grins etched on their face. Naruto scowled. He could stand simple rowdy drunks, but the lecherous stares they were direction in AM's direction made him mad. Not only were they trying to involve someone other than him in their grudge against the Kyuubi container, but they had bad intentions for AM if he somehow failed to protect her. His scowl turned to a determined and dark glare. Even though no one could see it. "Boy, Bright. We got some hick words for ya." "Yeah. Words." The self-appointed leader chuckled at his oh-so-witty undertone of violence, and his lackeys seemed to pick up on it, chuckling themselves. Naruto flicked the top of his sword out of the sheath with an audible clicking sound, making the drunkard's pause slightly. "Leave, now." Naruto didn't want to waste words with these men. The chance that they would actually leave was next to nothing, no matter what he said. He simply wanted just the ability to say that he had given the men a chance to leave if he had to fully explain the situation to the authorities without having to lie. AM shifted behind him uncomfortably and he noticed that she was now back to back with the wall, her knees up to her chin. Naruto shot her what he hoped was a confident grin before he turned back to the drunkards, unaware that AM wasn't scared at them. Rather, she was scared at him. Naruto had protected her from drunks before, but always before, he had simply run up to them and punched them silly while extolling his own virtues. This new Naruto. This darker Naruto. He was radiating killing intent like AM had never felt before coming from the blonde-haired Jinchuriki. Moreover, he had immediately reached for the sword on his back, meaning that he wasn't going to be holding back. While she was glad that he was so intent on protecting her, she was also afraid. They were just drunkards, right? Why was he going for his sword? Naruto noticed that the drunks just stared at him for a moment before they burst out laughing amongst each other. Naruto quirked an eyebrow at this, but said nothing, preferring to let the drunks get whatever it was out of their system. After a while of them laughing, they turned their gaze back to him, and to his annoyance, they pulled out small civilian knives from their clothes, flipping them open with an audible click. The leader looked much more menacing than he had before. "We'll carve your flesh, demon. And then we'll have our way with your whore." The lead drunk charged at him with his knife haphazardly slashing in front of him. Naruto sighed. It was obvious the man had no training. Nevertheless, he steeled himself. No one called AM a whore and came away unscarred. With another audible metal sound, his sword came out of his sheath. Naruto found the familiar weight in his hand to be comforting. Seconds later, the lead drunk arrived and Naruto simply steeled his resolve even further. With a deft movement of his left hand, he caught the man's forearm in a vice grip, causing the knife to drop from his hand and the man to cringe a little at the pain the ninja's grip was causing him. His pain, apparently, was nothing compared to what happened next. With an upward jerk, Naruto broke the man's radial and ulnar bones in half, effectively breaking the man's forearm in twain. The man screamed in pain and Naruto just smirked. It served him right for calling AM a whore. He brought his left leg up and bent at the knee slightly before he let go of the man's arm and kicked him solidly in the chest, sending him sprawling backwards. Naruto noticed that the other two were now giving him wary and almost frightened stares, but both still held their knives at the ready. Naruto acted on instinct. Bringing his left hand to the hilt of the sword, he charged at the man on his left, bringing his sword up above his head as he did so. The man attempted to dodge to the right, but Naruto had predicted that the man would try to dive out of the way. With a grunt, he brought his sword down on the man's chest, feeling a slight sense of satisfaction at hearing the drunk's collarbone give way and his torso spray a bit of blood from the relatively shallow vertical wound he had just inflicted on his opponent. He had at least made sure he missed the subclavian artery. The man screamed much the same as his companion had, falling to the ground unceremoniously, thrashing and clutching his chest. Naruto then turned his gaze to the third drunk, a portly man with a cleft chin. The man was shaking slightly, and it looked as though he had evacuated himself only seconds earlier. His knife, however, was still firmly in his hand. With another charge, he brought his sword to a horizontal position in front of him and performed a backwards twirl, bringing his knees to a crouch at the same time. Before the chubby man could even dodge, Naruto's sword been brought cleanly across the man's belly in a relatively shallow evisceration. Only a few inches deep. causing a small amount of blood and fat to leak from the wound. This man screamed in pain as well and clutched his stomach, falling down and writhing much the same as his other companions were. Naruto stood abruptly and forced a small amount of chakra into his sword to clean it, satisfied when the small amount of gore that was on his blade simply burned away harmlessly. With another metal sound, he locked his sword securely into his sheath and turned back to Am. He noted with both confusion and guilt that she was almost to the point of passing out. The girl wasn't a stranger to violence. She lived in a shinobi village, after all. But Naruto presumed that seeing such a methodical carving of his opponents was a bit too much for the normal civilian to bear. He started towards her and unlatched his mask, intent on calming the girl down, but after his first step, Am's look of fear only increased. He realized with a start that she wasn't afraid of the carving. Rather, of the carver. A hurt expression flashed over his face before he could stop it. Something that Am could clearly see with his mask off. And she seemed to realize just what was going on. After a deep breath with her eyes closed, Am seemed to calm considerably. Naruto took another step towards her and this time, she did not start like before. He extended a hand to the girl to help her up and she accepted graciously, throwing Naruto an apologetic smile. Naruto just returned the smile with one of his own, clearly forgiving her for her silent transgression. He supposed that he had been exuding a bit too much Kai during the fight. It was only natural that someone like Am would be affected by it, especially considering that it was laced with Kai Ubi's own killing intent, even without Naruto consciously adding it. Am leaned again on Naruto's shoulder and surveyed the men who were still groaning and occasionally whimpering slightly on the ground. We should probably go get some help for these guys. They made Am threw a slightly exasperated and yet amused look in Naruto's direction, and he allowed himself the luxury of letting his guard down enough to smile somewhat ashamedly back. They needn't have worried about it, however. What exactly happened here, Genin Uzumaki? Naruto looked up to see a normal two-person patrol of Anbu sitting crouched on the roof to their right. His features hardened once again and he turned towards them in a professional manner. These three thought it would be a good idea to attack me and Am while I was in the process of walking her home. They have since learned otherwise. Naruto could swear that he heard the tiger mask Anbu chuckle. Did they now? It looks as though they learned their lesson the hard way. Right then. Go ahead and escort Am sent to her home and then go home yourself. If we need more information on what transpired, we'll contact you. Naruto couldn't help but smirk slightly before he nodded. He slipped back on his mask and nodded to Am, who simply nodded herself while putting more of her weight on Naruto's shoulder. Naruto stopped for a moment, confusing Am, before she suddenly found his shoulder gone, replaced by him in a semi-squatting position in front of her. With his shoulder to lean on now absent, she fell slightly towards him, ending up leaning on his back. She found herself steadily rising afterwards and realized that she was now riding piggyback on Naruto. She chuckled. You know, you could have just said, get on my back. You didn't have to be so dramatic about it. Naruto flashed what she thought was a sheepish grin before he bounded up to the roof where the Anbu were still squatting. He made ready to take another leap when a hand on his shoulder stopped him. He looked back and saw the tiger mask Anbu staring at him. Kid. If you don't mind my asking. Why are you wearing a pure white Anbu mask? Naruto stared at him for a few moments before his gaze fell to the ground. Same reason you guys wear it. To keep my identity as hidden as possible. He remained silent after that and he thought that he saw the tiger Anbu flinch slightly before he just nodded. Taking that as a dismissal, Naruto bounded off across the rooftops once more, this time with the exited squeals and giggles of a childish acting Am in his ear. He smiled. He remembered about 6 months ago when he had first taken Am roof hopping. She had loved every minute of it. She had nearly deafened Naruto with her squeals of delight when he would jump especially high or go especially fast, and now that he was even faster and stronger than he had been then, he bounded even higher and went even faster, eliciting even more excited giggling from the girl on his back. All too soon, it was over, and they had arrived at the Ichiraku residence. The night crowd was finally beginning to come out, and Naruto could see that it was a full moon. He wasn't sure if this was a bad omen or a good one. Am climbed off his back and stood a bit shakily for a few moments before she unlocked the door, firing a smile at Naruto at the same time. Thanks Naruto, for protecting me tonight. Naruto just nodded sheepishly while maintaining his smile. Am walked up to him and gave him a hug, which he returned, before she shot him another grateful smile and walked into her house, vanishing behind the now closed door. Naruto allowed himself a moment to savor the feeling of family and happiness before he shook his head wistfully and chuckled to himself. That was another reason why he hated it when the Ichirakus lost business because of him. It felt like he was being a burden to his family. He began walking home, an unbidden smile on his face the whole way. The tiger mask Anbu sighed in motion for his partner to call the civilian police force. His partner just nodded and bounded off towards the police station, leaving him there to watch over the still whimpering drunks as they slowly passed out from the pain. He had recognized the boy behind the mask as being Uzumaki Naruto. Or rather, simply Naruto, as he was purported to be going by now. If he remembered correctly, the boy was one of Kakashi-senpai's new students, along with the Uchiha prodigy and the Haruno girl. It struck him as odd that the boy was so different from what most people, especially ninja, remembered of him. Bright blonde hair, equally bright disposition, tacky orange clothing. None of what he had seen tonight had matched with the description of the boy that most ninjas looked out for. Almost all Anbu at one time or another had come across the boy in their duties, usually to save him from a mob of villagers or on the onus of the Sandaime to see to it that the boy was in good health. The majority of the ninja in the village, and especially the Anbu, respected the boy rather well, and he was almost an unofficial charge of the Anbu. Or rather, he had been, until he had become a ninja. Tenzo smiled. It looked as though the boy no longer needed their protection. He was broken from his musings as his partner returned with 3 civilian policemen hot on his tails. The police of Konoha had minimal ninja training. Just enough to travel like a ninja, and usually enough to defeat a genin if one were to get out of hand. Anbu were usually the first responders as it were, and the police were usually the ones who handled the scene, as well as the prosecution of anyone involved. The problem with this, at least in this particular case, was that the police were almost to a member, civilians. Very few of them had been ninja at any point in time, and this meant that they probably harbored a marked dislike of Naruto. Tenzo scowled. He supposed that was why he had stuck around. If they began to try to blame Naruto for any of this, he would set them straight. Tora-san, what exactly occurred here tonight? The lead policeman had walked up to him and was standing with a semi-formal posture above him, his face set in impassivity. Tenzo stood and gazed down at the scene, watching as a few medic nin tended to the drunk's injuries. These 3 men attacked a Konoha ninja and a woman under his protection. The ninja fought back and disabled them. I have already sent him on his way. Tenzo quietly hoped that perhaps they didn't need the boy's name. That by some chance, they would simply believe him and write it off as a case of being drunk and stupid. He had no such luck. If I might ask, what is the name of the ninja that caused these men's injuries? Simply for records purposes of course. The man looked decidedly bored at the moment. Tenzo cursed under his breath. Uzumaki Naruto. The man immediately snapped his head in his direction and his boredom seemed to disappear instantly. Tenzo scowled. He remembered this man now. He had been one of the more troublesome elements within the police force for years regarding Naruto. He had literally gone on several witch hunts trying to prove the boy guilty of this or that. He had failed of course, but it had prompted the Sandaime to have a chat with him a few years ago. He had been markedly less troublesome since. The man seemed to scowl before he tried to school his face once more. He failed horribly. I see. I'll take this from here then. If I need more information, I'll contact you. The man turned to hop off the roof where they were conversing, but Tenzo could see that the man was obviously going to try to slant this in a more favorable direction. He might have been persuaded to stop his witch hunts, but in a situation like this, the man was perfectly justified in launching a full investigation. He put his hand on the man's shoulder and turned him around, at the same time unhinging his mask and pulling it off. The man sent him a slightly startled gaze before it quickly turned to irritated. He was about to speak, but Tenzo never gave him the chance. Putting on his scary face that he used for real opponents, he glared at the man pointedly. If I hear that you are pursuing Naruto unjustly in this particular case, you will be hearing from me and my comrades, do you understand? The man's face immediately turned to one of terror before he simply nodded furiously, obviously scared out of his wits by both the face he was making and the small amount of kai that he was exuding. Tenzo couldn't help but smirk. The man was tough enough to pick on a kid, but when faced with an adult, he was putty. In short, he was a coward. He put his mask back on and signaled for his companion to follow him as they bounded off the roof towards the Hokage Tower. There had been another observer to the whole scene. And if his hunch was correct. With a quick hand seal, he formed a Moku Bunshin that sped off in a separate direction. He grimaced. Perhaps Naruto needed the Anbu's protection now more than ever, especially if he was after him. The Hokage would undoubtedly want to know about this. The other observer slinked out of the shadows of the alleyway and bounded off in a separate direction, releasing the camouflage jutsu that he had been hiding under. Taichi would be interested in this. Very interested. The boy was becoming very skilled very quickly. This would mean moving up their timetable. He vanished into the night, himself never noticing the wooden ninja following him at a distance. You know, you could have just summoned me. Naruto smirked at the Kyuubi resting in front of the fireplace in the seal, watching as her face contorted into one of irritation and frustration. He had just gotten done telling her about the escapades that had occurred, and Kyuubi was slightly peeved that she hadn't gotten the chance to fight with him. Oh, but you were sleeping oh so cutely on the couch, dreaming of chasing rabbits and morsels. I didn't want to interrupt anything important. Naruto's smirk widened upon seeing Kyuubi's semi-astonished gaze and embarrassed blush before she turned away from him, attempting to hide said blush. Failing miserably. I talk in my sleep I never knew. Oh. Damn it. Naruto outright laughed at the flustered fox in front of him as she attempted to bury her face even further into her chair to hide her blush. After a few minutes of friendly jibing, Kyuubi ended the conversation with a playful bop on his head, resulting in a slightly raised contusion on his scalp. It was his turn to scowl, but they both ended up just smiling at each other amusedly in the end. Kyuubi cleared her throat and walked outside, a curious Naruto following at her heels. Kyuubi walked in the grass for a while before she stopped at what looked like a garden. Something Naruto hadn't remembered creating. Kyuubi saw his confused stare and hid a smirk of her own. I created this garden a little while back. It's filled with healing herbs, poisonous plants, and plants with other various effects to them that you are going to be learning about. Naruto looked astonished for a moment before he nodded and stared at the garden with barely restrained curiosity, causing Kyuubi to fully smile at the Naruto that she knew still existed within him. Childish, playful and more than willing to learn. She walked to a bush with red berries growing off of it. It looked very much like a pine tree, or perhaps a pine bush would be more fitting. This plant is known as the yew. She snapped off one of the berries and held it in her hand placidly. Naruto looked in on it and stared at it expectantly. This berry seed contains enough toxins to kill a horse. Naruto's eyes widened considerably and he nearly fell on his butt trying to back away from the berry. Kyuubi guffawed, earning her an irritated glare from Naruto. After she calmed down and Naruto was steady on his feet, she continued. It acts on the cardiac system, causing cardiac arrhythmia and usually death within no more than a few hours after application. Most effective when ingested, but can be effective if applied topically to an open wound or from a cut with a sword or senbon. It's a rather common plant around Konoha, I'd imagine. Naruto gaped at her for a moment before he nodded hesitantly. Kyuubi just threw the berry back into the garden, walking up to another plant that looked much more common, like a regular shrubbery. It had a few ovoid orange pieces of fruit growing from the stems and the leaves were very much spade-shaped, parachuting slightly. Naruto noticed that Kyuubi had an almost evil glint in her eye. He gulped. This plant grows almost exclusively in this part of the world. It is known simply as the strychnine tree. Nothing about the tree is poisonous. Not the leaves, not the fruit, not the bark. Nothing. However, if you break open the fruit. Kyuubi snatched one of the pieces of fruit off the tree and twisted it in half. The seeds inside of it produce a poison aptly named as strychnine. It is one of the most potent poisons in the entire world and if you concentrate it enough on the edge of a blade or senbon, it can cause intense pain, instantaneous rigor mortis, convulsions and asphyxiation in the space of just a few minutes. It is truly a horrible poison. Naruto literally gaped. Asphyxiation was truly one of the most horrible ways to die and considering that this poison not only caused asphyxiation but also pain and convulsions. For a moment, he considered not even using this knowledge, but quickly drove that thought from his mind. Someone, somewhere, deserved it. Besides. You used what tools you had as a ninja, regardless of the humanity or lack thereof. Kyuubi saw the emotions play across Naruto's face and knew that he understood the absolute terror of strychnine. It would probably be the first poison she would teach him how to make. And it might even be the last. Strychnine was very much all one needed to brutally kill someone. She tossed the halved fruit and the seeds back into the garden and proceeded to another plant that Naruto had probably seen before. Naruto looked at her rather confusedly. Almonds. Almonds are a poison. Kyuubi smirked once more. No. Almonds are not poisonous. In fact, they're perfectly safe for ingestion. However. She proceeded to grab an almond and crush it in her hand. A small amount of liquid glistened from the crushed pieces. In an almond, there are traces of a chemical compound that is easily one of the most deadly substances in the world. If you were to crush enough almonds and separate the chemicals properly in your chemistry lab. Naruto looked uninterestedly and Kyuubi's smirk became a fully evil smile. Tell me. Have you ever heard of cyanide? He had never really realized until now just how depressing the uchiha compound was. After having spent the past month training with Naruto, he had come to a startling realization. Naruto's house was one of the only places he had ever been to that had ever felt like a home. It held an atmosphere of safety, comfort and contentedness that Sasuke hadn't felt since his family had been alive. The Uchiha compound, he had realized, had stopped being a home the day that Itachi had killed off those that had made it as such. It was nothing more than a collection of houses now, all of them holding the shadows of blood and grief that Sasuke had fed on. Until now. He had used the reminders of the massacre that pervaded the Uchiha compound to fuel his desire for revenge. His hatred and rage had been fueled constantly by the seemingly unchangeable streets that were once busy and alive. Every time he had seen his house, he had been reminded of his goals. Every time he had seen Itachi's stark empty room, he had been reminded of the cause for his hatred. Every time he saw the cracked uchiha crest that his brother had mangled, he had been reminded of who he was. An avenger. But for whatever reason, its influence was no longer welcome. He had ceased to be angered by the compound, ceased to be motivated by the years-old bloodstains. Rather, now, it gave him a deep pang of sadness, an almost insatiable desire to simply leave and never come back. He now wanted to simply turn his back on this place and never return. At least, not until he had accomplished what he was meant to do. He wasn't sure he could face his family, his friends, until his desire was fulfilled completely. In a way, this angered him more than even the reminders of his dead family did. Was he losing his edge? Was he losing his motivation? He was still an avenger, he was still after revenge, and he would kill Itachi. Right. Moreover, his family was yearning for such a thing. Their spirits cried for vengeance. Didn't they? Was Naruto to blame for his lack of motivation? Was Naruto the one who had made him stray from his path? As he walked the path that led to the exit from the compound, he pushed those thoughts to the edge of his mind. If anything, he had gotten stronger in the past month from training with Naruto and Kyuubi than he had in the past 6 years. He was stronger, faster, more agile. He had more chakra, he had better control, he knew more jutsu. In effect, he was a better ninja now than he had been a month ago, simply because he had trained with the one person who he had come to acknowledge as a friend. Even if only to himself. He had Naruto, his friend, to thank for his newfound power and ability. But was it worth it? Was losing his insatiable desire for revenge? His hatred, his vengeance, his passion. Was losing all of those worth becoming more powerful? Why was he even becoming more powerful if not to fulfill his goals? If one lost their goals but gained power, was that enough? Rather, could you ever truly lose your goal in the first place, or was it something so deeply ingrained into one's psyche as to be considered permanent? Sasuke scowled. He was being too introspective and existential. In the long run of things, gaining power was all he cared about. His goal would still be there. His hatred, his vengeance, his loathing of his brother. Those things could fall to the wayside if it meant that he gained power because of it. His goal was independent of his life and his emotions. His goals and ambitions would be fulfilled, regardless of his feelings on the matter. He wondered, for a moment, if perhaps he should ask Naruto if he could move in with him. It would take an act of God himself to make him humble enough to ask. And an even greater act to make Naruto accept. Nevertheless. His power was due to Naruto and due to his training. Naruto's home was power. Sasuke could use that. He pushed that particular thought to the back of his mind to be pondered on later. After a few more minutes of walking, he arrived at Team 7's bridge, noting that he was the first one there. He took his usual perch on the side of the bridge and waited. He noted that after a few more minutes, Sakura arrived and greeted him in her normal fashion, before babbling about something that he didn't quite listen to. After a few more minutes, Naruto arrived and grunted out a greeting which Sasuke returned just as animatedly. Sakura, as per usual, looked irritated and scowled to herself. Sasuke nearly smirked. It was a very normal morning. While they waited for their always tardy sensei, Sasuke and Naruto both trained their senses. Sasuke had learned. At least somewhat. How to enhance his own senses through the application of chakra through the tracking exercises that Kyuubi had drilled them on. He wasn't nearly as good as Naruto was, however he was able to pick up scents and hear various things that most people couldn't. He took at least some pride in the fact that he was still better than probably every genin out there save for Naruto himself, although, he promised himself that one day he would overtake Naruto's skill level. Somehow. He focused chakra to his nose, ears and eyes, scanning the area with all 3 senses. He had hoped that by applying chakra to his eyes, he would somehow activate his Sharingan. A hope that Naruto shared, but Sasuke didn't exactly know that. So far, both had been unsuccessful, but Sasuke held out hope that his activation would come soon. He noticed that there were a few new smells present that he had not really smelled before, and he focused on them as best he could. He realized with a slight frown that what he was smelling was blood. Moreover, it wasn't Naruto's or his blood. He had been able to pinpoint those particular smells early on in training, having been subjected to both smells due to various injuries they had sustained during their attempts to get stronger. The smells he noticed were different. In fact, he noticed 2 distinct different smells of blood coming from Naruto that had not been there previously. He turned to Naruto and frowned, noticing that Naruto too was simply standing there training his senses. The small amount of chakra he was using was proof enough of that. Naruto. Naruto turned around to Sasuke's calling him and fixed him with an impassive stare that Sasuke couldn't discern from under his mask. What? Sasuke narrowed his eyes slightly before asking. Why is it that you smell of blood? Naruto started for a moment before he realized that he hadn't cleaned his armor off the night before. He made a mental note to get into the habit of cleaning his equipment after a fight. I got into a fight last night with some drunks who wanted to hurt him. Cut two of them up pretty badly. I broke the third's forearm in half. Sakura looked stunned, but Sasuke's visage remained relatively unchanged, save for the smirk that now adorned it. I see. You never could resist a good fight, could you? Naruto smirked as well, but Sasuke couldn't see it. I suppose not. Then again, they called AM some bad things. I had to teach them a lesson. They live with a few scars to remind them of that. Sasuke's smirk only widened before he shook his head and turned back around, resolving to train his senses once more. Naruto did the same. Sakura, however, was livid, stunned, and a bit afraid. Livid at the fact that Naruto and Sasuke could converse so easily between themselves. Stunned that Naruto was so cold and distant in regards to injuring and cutting people. And afraid. She was afraid because Naruto seemed like he enjoyed it. She herself simply knew that she would never enjoy hurting people, no matter how bad or evil they were. It simply wasn't in her nature. Moreover, while she would kick some drunk's ass without compunction, she wouldn't cut them up, no matter what they said or did. Such violence was unbecoming of a lady. She considered opening her mouth and berating Naruto for a moment, but decided against it. Naruto was becoming dangerous. If he could so easily cripple a few drunken civilians, perhaps he could just as easily cripple her. Until she knew that Naruto wasn't somehow a psychopathic murderer or some sort of sadist, she figured that she had to play it safe. All three members of Team 7 simply stood there in silence until they heard a telltale pop sounding on the east side of the bridge, alerting them to the fact that Kakashi had arrived. Sasuke scowled, as usual, at his lateness, and Sakura yelled her normal greeting of "You're late." Naruto simply stood there. "Sorry I'm late, I had to help." Bullshit. One day, I'll find out what you really do before you come here, and when I do, I'll remove whatever it is that you hold so dear as to be late to your own team's meetings from this world forever. Naruto's tone was cold and uncaring, and Kakashi's sweat dropped at the childish yet vicious anger that was directed at him. Sasuke just shook his head, and Sakura nearly fell on her butt from the absurdity of it. Kakashi merely waved him off. "Right. Well, we have a new mission to do. Follow me." The three did exactly as he ordered and followed him to a wooded area with undergrowth just a few miles from their bridge. Naruto had a bad feeling about this, as did Sasuke. Sakura apparently had no idea. Kakashi smiled at them and got out his book. "Your mission today is to capture Tora the cat." Naruto drew his sword, Sasuke cracked his knuckles, and Sakura drew a kunai, all three emitting a vicious level of killing intent. They all decided in their minds that this would be the last time they were forced to capture the damned cat. It would meet its end this day. Kakashi merely sweat dropped. Perhaps he should have chosen a different mission. He almost felt sorry for the poor feline. Almost. Peeved and irritated as all Hell Team 7 stood before the Hokage in the mission room of the Hokage Tower, looking to the entire world as though they had just been dragged through the forest of death. Naruto's fists were shaking, Sasuke's eyebrow had developed an incurable twitch, and Sakura had allowed inner Sakura some freedom, spewing curse words under her breath that would have made even the most seasoned of Jounin jealous. Kakashi's eye belied none of this, curving itself into its usual upside-down U-shape that indicated he was smiling. Mission to retrieve Tora the cat, unharmed. Complete. The owner of Tora, a large woman with copious amounts of jewelry and makeup on, was currently snuggling, strangling, said cat within an inch of its life. The cat, however, was apparently taking it much better than usual, having been subjected to the utter and complete fear that was Team 7 when they were angry. Rather than having to deal with the three genin again, the cat resolved to simply take the lesser of two evils. Figuring that what its owner could do to it was nothing in comparison to the raw and absolute terror that it had experienced while being chased. In fact, Sasuke, Naruto and Sakura had worked more efficiently as a team than they ever had before. They each had one goal in mind. The complete and utter destruction of Tora. Sakura had chased said cat through a minefield, earning her some singed hair and clothes. But the cat also had been terrified of the explosions that had occurred. Sasuke had burned down a good portion of forest while throwing fire jutsu at the cat in his chase, earning Sasuke some singes and burns, but again, scaring Tora to the brink of death. Naruto, however, had to have been the most fearsome. The boy had all but buried the cat in the earth, sinking it into the mud on several occasions and throwing even more fire jutsu at the cat. He had cut every branch Tora had tried to hide on and even felled a few trees in his attempt to either crush, burn or mince the cat to death. She had been lucky to escape a small rain of kunai and shuriken that the boy had thrown at her, and even luckier to have survived a few times when one of his clones had simply detonated in close proximity. Thus, Tora the cat resolved never to run away again. She had survived only by the graces of the tall one-eyed man picking her up by the scruff before a Kaiten jutsu had annihilated the ground she had been standing on. However, the look the one-eyed man had given her had clearly said that it would be the first, last and only time he would save her. Without the one-eyed man to stop the terrifying trio. Tora mewed pitifully. Yes, even her owner was preferable to experiencing that again. Sarutobi, predictably, found this all to be incredibly humorous, much to the chagrin of Team 7's Genin. He began to sift through various other missions that they could accomplish before the day was over, while Tora's owner paid the cashier, and when she was out the door, he cleared his throat. Team 7, I have 3 possible jobs for you to do. The first is to pick up some groceries for a kindly old lady that lives on the south side. The second is to babysit a young child, and the third is to paint a fence. No. Everyone looked up to see Naruto simply gazing at the Hokage impassively, his mask, for once, taken off his face. His eyes, however, contained slit pupils. If all we're going to be doing is MD class mission, then I do not want one. I'm tired, dirty, bloody, and pissed off. I am going to go home, soak in my onsen, and then train for the rest of the day. When I come back tomorrow, I want to see class mission. Do we have an understanding, old man? Iruka stood up so fast his chair fell to the ground. Naruto. You do not speak to the Hokage in such a fashion. Your use of old man I could tolerate, but you do not demand things from your Hokage. You do not threaten him. Do I make myself clear, Naruto? Everyone, including the Hokage, gaped at the normally placid and good-natured man who had just delivered a fiery tirade against his once pupil. After a few moments of this stunned silence, Sarutobi began to chuckle, which served to both break everyone from their stupor, as well as lighten the mood considerably. Iruka simply looked confused. Startled. A host of emotions were written on his face. Perhaps Iruka was just as surprised at his uncharacteristic outburst as everyone else was. Lightening the mood further, Sarutobi shook his head and took a drag from his pipe. I'm sure Naruto didn't mean anything threatening by it, Iruka-kun. If I had been doing D-rank missions for a month, especially with that accursed cat, I would be rather irked as well, I imagine. Iruka had the decency to blush and apologize softly, while Naruto seemed to have realized just what he had said. He bowed deeply, surprising everyone present. Forgive me, Hokage-sama. I did not mean to insult or threaten you. Truly, Naruto was peeved and ashamed at himself for even insinuating that he somehow was able to give orders to his surrogate grandfather. And he was immensely relieved that Sarutobi had brushed it off as easily as he did. The Hokage looked at Naruto curiously for a moment before he chuckled again and waved him off. No harm done, Naruto. If a C-ranked mission is what you want. And your sensei agrees. Kakashi nodded slightly. Then a C-ranked mission is what you shall receive when you come in for your mission assignments tomorrow. I suggest you take the rest of today to prepare for a trip outside of the village. All of Team 7 nodded and bowed slightly, Naruto throwing Sarutobi a grateful and apologetic grin before they turned and exited the double doors quietly. To his surprise, Hinata was standing just outside the doorway with the members of her team flanking her on either side. A red-eyed Jounin instructor stood behind them, giving Kakashi a dirty look for having his notorious book out in front of the impressionable children. Naruto, with mask still off, shot a foxy grin at Hinata, hoping to elicit some sort of usual Hinata-type response from the girl. While Hinata did in fact blush, it was tempered with a frown that fully reached her eyes. Naruto scowled. He still had no idea what was wrong with the girl. He was about to simply turn around and walk out when a bark interrupted his thoughts. Yeah, he does smell different. Hey, Naruto, what did you do to yourself, man? You look and smell completely different. Naruto looked back to see Kiba giving him a confused yet strangely feral look, noting that Hinata had fixed her eyes firmly on the floor. Shino stood there, dead to the world, however it looked as though he was talking to some sort of bug perched on his hand. Surprisingly, he was the one to speak next. I concur with Kiba. My bugs note something different about you, Naruto. Naruto, thinking quickly, tried to come up with some sort of retort. He focused on just telling a half-truth. I've been working with my newly discovered bloodline, Kiba. It grants me certain chakra benefits. That is why I smell and feel different to both of you. He noticed Sasuke repress a smirk, and even the red-eyed Jounin instructor seemed to look a bit appreciative that he was able to come up with such a spot-on explanation for his condition as a Jinchuriki. It was said Jounin instructor that interrupted the conversation. I'm sure we're all interested in Naruto's abilities, but we have a mission to get, remember? She smiled slightly at Kiba's disappointed scowl, but obediently, he and his teammates walked into the missions room forthwith. Kakashi too shooed Sasuke and Sakura back down the stairs, leaving Naruto and the woman alone in the hallway. The red-eyed woman gave him a smile. Sorry about that. They're a bit inquisitive. My name is Yuhi Kurenai, by the way. Nice to meet you. Naruto gave her a disarming smile, noting that the woman was gazing at him with a look he had seen on many women in the village over the past month. Nice to meet you as well, Kurenai-san. But aren't I a bit young for you? He noticed with satisfaction that she blushed and gasped slightly. While the woman was undeniably beautiful, she had to be at least 15 years his senior. Even he had his limits. Kurenai compassed herself quickly and shook her head chuckling. I suppose so, Naruto-kun. You'll be a heartbreaker one of these days. Naruto smirked. Yeah, assuming they don't find out about it. That effectively killed the mood, accomplishing exactly what he wanted to accomplish. He wasn't exactly enjoying this line of conversation. He got a slightly annoyed glare from the fox positioned around his neck. She probably resented being referred to as an it. Kurenai's expression sobered, but she maintained a slight smile. I think you underestimate the people of Konoha, Naruto. You've had a bad life, I imagine. But give them a chance. They'll come around in time. Naruto's smirk turned to a sad smile, and he shook his head, bowing it slightly to reattach his mask. If anything, Kurenai-san. He turned his back and began walking away. He stopped and turned back to her. If anything. I overestimate them. I'm afraid I don't have nearly the faith left in Konoha that you do. With that, he turned his back and walked away completely, leaving a fully somber and just slightly disillusioned Kurenai behind. Shaking herself from her thoughts after a few moments of introspection, she ambled into the mission room to find Kiba in some sort of heated and one-sided discussion with Shino on the merits of dogs versus insects. The Hokage raised his hand, signaling for silence. Which was surprisingly effective. Kurenai noted that their team had asked for a C-ranked mission for today, and they would be getting it. Sarutobi looked at his paper for a moment before taking a drag on his pipe. I understand you asked for a C rank. Your request was approved. He motioned to the door on his left. Please come in, Tazuna. Sakura cursed. Normally, she didn't allow herself the luxury of cursing. She was a lady. Ladies didn't curse. They accepted everything with a gracious smile and a blush and allowed their inner selves to take out their frustration on something at a later time. But this was curse-worthy. Their team would be receiving a C-ranked mission. Not only that, but it was at the behest of Naruto and not Sasuke. Did this mean that Sasuke wasn't prepared for a C-ranked mission? Did this mean that he didn't want a C-ranked mission? If Naruto was making Sasuke go on a mission he didn't want to go on, there would be hell to pay. She sighed and flopped herself down on her fluffy mattress, noting that her mom had changed the sheets while she had been away. She had just gotten out of the shower, and the concept that they would be going on a mission outside of the village had just now been able to penetrate her skull. She had only been out of the village once before in her life, and that had been to visit an aunt of hers that lived up in the mountains. Or at least, her mother called her an aunt. As far as she knew, there was no family relation. Her mother was good friends with a medic nin who lived communally on the local mountain range, and she had been 6 at the time. It wasn't exactly as if she would have questioned her mother referring to the woman as her aunt. Besides, Rin was a strange name anyway. She pushed these thoughts from her mind as she curled around her pillow, giving off a shuddering sigh. Unknown to Naruto, his words had hit their mark. Even a month down the road, his scathing assessment of her ninja abilities as well as her desire and motivation thereof had spurred her to take a good look inward. What she had found had been at least somewhat depressing. Naruto had been right, even if she would never admit to such a thing. While she was undoubtedly book-smart as her teachers had called her, her practical skills were indeed lacking. Although, she hadn't done anything about it. The girl in her had forbidden herself training. It would have messed up her already subpar figure, and no doubt Sasuke-kun would want a girl who had long flowing hair and a delicate frame. Besides, Sasuke, and to a lesser extent Naruto, were there to save her when she got into trouble. Kakashi was a capable ninja, right? She was fine. While she wasn't the best ninja in the world, she probably wasn't the worst either. Until she got Sasuke-kun, her skills would do. She drifted off into an afternoon nap, dreaming about her future beau and the times they would spend together. However, the best laid plans of mice and fangirls often go awry. Sasuke. You might want to back up a bit. Sasuke complied, watching as Naruto sat in a lotus position in the middle of their training ground. Shortly after their departure from the Hokage Tower, both boys had found themselves heading for Naruto's home and they had already been training for about 3 hours now. Naruto had simply been training his chakra natures and physical body, and Sasuke had been training more with his taijutsu style. A few minutes ago, though, Kyuubi had interrupted him, telling him that Naruto would be doing something interesting. He was a bit peeved at having been interrupted, but Sasuke was curious as to what Naruto was actually attempting to accomplish. Seeing his confusion, Kyuubi walked up to him and sat down against a nearby rock. He's going to be releasing another suppression seal. Basically, it allows him unrestricted access to more of my own chakra. Normally, we would have waited about another 2 months before attempting this. But we're hoping that it stabilizes his chakra control enough to allow him to produce a completed Rasengan." Sasuke looked impressed for a moment before his face schooled itself into a half grimace. Naruto would be getting stronger. Again. He made a mental note to double his own training regimen. After a few moments of silence, a reddish aura began to surround Naruto and envelop him in a slightly red-orange haze that obscured him from view. For a few moments, Sasuke looked on confused. But then he was pushed back into the rock by a shockwave. Naruto had all but exploded. Red chakra and killing intent had literally gushed out of the blonde-haired genin, and Sasuke found himself hard-pressed to breathe, let alone stand up. The red haze was now even thicker than before, but curiously, Sasuke could see into it enough to make out the shape of a writhing in pain Naruto thrashing about on the ground, clutching his stomach. He tried to make himself stand up, but his legs wouldn't obey him. His arms wouldn't obey him. He was completely disabled. He was able to steal a slight glance at Kyuubi, noting that she seemed to be wholly unaffected. Kyuubi, noticing Sasuke's condition, simply reached out a hand and touched the boy's shoulder. The effects were instantaneous. He was able to breathe again, and his limbs once again responded to his commands. He made to try to stand again, but Kyuubi's hand grabbed onto his shoulder as she shook her head, silently commanding Sasuke to simply stay put. Naruto, on the other hand, was finding a completely new definition of the word pain. It enshrouded him and battered him senseless, and it filled his entire world to the brim. His stomach burned and ached, his veins and chakra pathways threatened to explode, and his throat was already raw from screaming, although, curiously, no sound seemed to be escaping. All he had done was trip a switch as Kyuubi had put it, and his world had exploded. He made a mental note to berate the fox for completely failing to mention the pain aspect to him. After a few minutes more of the blinding, mind-numbing pain, it stopped as quickly as it began. He lay in a sweaty, dirty and panting pile on the ground, not daring to stand. After a few moments, he heard slightly subdued footsteps coming towards him and risked craning his neck to the side to see Sasuke and Kyuubi coming towards him at a tentative pace. He flashed them both a grin, even though they couldn't see it. That wasn't so bad. Except for the mind-numbing pain thing. "Damn it, Kyuubi, next time, tell me about that." Kyuubi had the grace to look sheepish. "Sorry. Last time you didn't complain much. But then again, you were kind of passed out." Sasuke and Naruto both sweat dropped at this, and Kyuubi just laughed nervously. Sasuke smirked and came over to Naruto, extending his hand. Naruto took it gratefully, heaving himself up and dusting himself off, noting that his chakra coils felt fuller than they'd ever been. He smirked. He could already feel the extra chakra added to himself. With a quick nod to Sasuke, he began to try to form the Rasengan in his right hand when he stopped cold and gasped. Sasuke. You're." He stared straight at Sasuke, not quite believing his eyes. Kyuubi looked confused as well before she too looked at Sasuke and gasped. Sasuke looked at them both, irritated. "What are you staring at? Do I have something on my face? Did I cut open my head or something?" Noting that neither one was responding after a minute or so, he scowled and shook his head, turning around to go back to his usual taijutsu training area. Or rather, he would have if he hadn't been bodily picked up by two Naruto clones and dragged into the house. Nah, Naruto, what the hell? He got absolutely no response from either of the clones and watched as the real Naruto and Kyuubi both walked placidly behind him. Kyuubi had the audacity to smirk. Sasuke scowled. Whatever was going on, he made a mental note to kick the shit out of Naruto next chance he got. After a few more minutes of letting himself be carried, they arrived upstairs at what looked to be a bathroom. The Naruto clones poofed out of existence after they let him down, and Sasuke scrambled to his feet, throwing a murderous glare at Naruto in the process. "Just what the hell do you think you're doing? If this is some kind of a joke." "Sasuke, go into the bathroom and look into the mirror." It was Kyuubi talking this time. Naruto was scowling with his mask off in a very unusual display of jealousy. Sasuke wondered just what he had to be jealous of. Against his better judgment, he walked into the bathroom and took a look in the mirror, just as Kyuubi had asked. At first, he didn't notice anything different. A few scuff marks from when he had fallen. His hair was mussed up a bit and his clothing had a few insignificant tears in it. His eyes were red. His cheeks had some dirt on them. Sasuke froze. Eyes. Red. And? They had black spots in them. No. They were more like Tomo. Sasuke gasped and his eyes widened to an impossible size before a very uncharacteristic grin made its way onto his face. He had it. After so many years of trying and training and failing. He had done it. They were only the very first level. But. He stared into his red eyes in the mirror, taking note of the one Tomo each eye sported, before he laughed. He had the Sharingan. The question is, how did you manage to activate it so easily? Kyuubi, Naruto and Sasuke were sitting in Naruto's living room chatting about Sasuke's new ability with restrained curiosity. Both Kyuubi and Naruto both had been very hesitant to even speak of it for fear of somehow blurting out something private, but Sasuke had been entirely too receptive to their questions to pass up the opportunity. They were learning more about the Sharingan and its benefits than they had ever known before, and Kyuubi was busy trying to figure out just what had actually caused Sasuke's Sharingan to activate. Sasuke shrugged, his smile still present on his face, although much more subdued than it had been. I have my ideas, but to be honest, I don't much care. I'm focusing on the fact that I have it. Not how. Kyuubi repressed a scowl. They weren't getting anywhere in that direction. Sasuke had been entirely uncooperative with Kyuubi's attempts to get him to open up about the process of activation, and she simply hoped that her motivation wasn't showing through. She chanced a glance at Naruto, noting that he was deep in thought on something. She quirked an eyebrow but said nothing, preferring to try to figure this whole thing out. It's obvious that my chakra had something to do with it. Actually. If I remember right, when I brought you out of the paralysis induced by my Kai, your eyes were already red. Perhaps my chakra interacted with your own to create a period of intense stress. She trailed off, trying to think of everything she could remember about human ocular anatomy. Sasuke, were you training your senses while I was releasing the seal? Kyuubi was surprised that Naruto had spoken so quietly and seriously, but recognized his line of thinking immediately. Sasuke looked confused for a moment before realization dawned on his face. Yeah, I was. I was focusing chakra to my eyes, ears and nose at the time. Her chakra must have activated something inside my eyes or brain or something. And the chakra to my eyes activated the Sharingan because of it. Naruto was still for a few moments before he nodded and went back to thinking, surprising Kyuubi once more. Sasuke simply shrugged and leaned back, his smile still present on his face. Now that I have these eyes. There's nothing I can't learn. He smirked for a moment. I might even be able to surpass you, Naruto. If Naruto was irked or amused, he didn't show it. His gaze was fixed solely on the floor, a very serious and thoughtful expression adorning his face. Sasuke seemed to lose a bit of his luster at seeing his rival and friend in this state, and even Kyuubi was a bit concerned. Naruto had never acted like this before. So deep in thought that he didn't even react to others' jibes or comments. For a moment, she considered conversing through their telepathic link, but she quickly dismissed that thought by speaking words that made her freeze. Sasuke. He sighed and closed his eyes briefly, seemingly resigned to something. You remember when I told you that there were things that I couldn't, or wouldn't, tell you about myself? Kyuubi started and gave Naruto a pointed and piercing glare, silently warning him. If he really wanted to tell Sasuke, she couldn't and wouldn't stop him. But it had only been a month. Was it really prudent? She mentally resigned herself to simply watch it all unfold. Whether or not it was a good idea was a moot point. It came down to the fact that what Naruto wanted to tell Sasuke, he simply would, regardless of her advice. Sasuke gave Naruto a surprised stare and nodded, his smile slipping off of his face rather quickly. Naruto bowed his head and allowed his bangs to hide his eyes, his mask set aside for the moment. It seemed like minutes before he spoke again. That day after the Genin exam. When I changed both mentally and physically. It was due to a seal placed on me at birth that made me look, act and think differently than I would otherwise. I won't go into details, Sasuke. Mostly because they're impertinent to the situation. But without this seal affecting me, I gained my true appearance, the one that you see now. My hair darkened, my face elongated, I grew taller, my whisker marks became more pronounced. And my eyes. He paused for a moment before sighing, noting that Sasuke by now was absolutely riveted to the conversation. Kyuubi just bit her bottom lip. This seal hid all evidence of my mother's genetics from me. In essence, I became my father's clone. However, certain traits of my mother's were revealed when the seal was removed. The change in my eyes is a direct result of that. He looked up and gazed directly into eyes that were exactly like his own. Tell me, Sasuke. What group of people in Konoha have ever had jet black eyes? The room seemed to go completely silent for a few moments before the sound of a choke and a gasp echoed throughout. Kyuubi looked to see that Naruto's eyes were now closed and his head was tilted downward. Sasuke, on the other hand, was completely taut. He was sitting straight up in his chair, his eyes wider than Kyuubi had ever seen them. His hands were shaking on the recliner armrests and his complexion, if possible, was even paler than usual. His mouth was open in a half gape and it was making a rather good fish impression, opening and closing ever so slightly every few seconds. After what seemed like minutes of silence, a shaky, half-hopeful, half-furious voice broke it. You can't be. No. You aren't saying. You aren't implying that you are. Naruto looked up and stared straight into Sasuke's own quivering eyes again, looking both apologetic and determined at the same time. Kyuubi could do naught but look on, feeling very much the unwanted spectator. She hoped that Naruto had really thought about what he was doing. And she desperately hoped that it didn't destroy whatever friendship they had cultivated. My mother. She was killed when Kyuubi attacked. She had to keep her relationship with my father a secret, so no one really knew. No one really knows about this except for you, the Hokage, Kakashi-sensei, Iruka-sensei, Hyuga Hiashi and Higurashi Kaseki. I was told not to tell anyone besides them about my father. But, I think, if I can tell anyone about my mother, it's you. Sasuke looked even paler than before, and Kyuubi bit her bottom lip harder to keep from shaking in apprehension. Naruto sighed once more and collected himself. Sasuke, my mother's name was Misao. Uchiha Misao. The shadow detached itself from the side of the house, taking to the rooftops as quickly as he possibly could. This changed everything. If the Kyuubi brat was an Uchiha, that meant he had the possibility of awakening the Sharingan. Taichu would be extremely interested. This opened possibilities that hadn't even been explored before. Orochimaru could get what he wanted, and Taichu could get what he wanted. In the end, everyone of importance won. As he lightly touched down on a nearby rooftop, preparing to take off once more, he felt a presence behind him and then felt no more. Tenzo scowled. It had been exactly as he suspected. He wiped off his Anbu-issue katana of the blood it had clinging to it before he sheathed it and motioned for his partner to dispose of the body. With a swift nod, his bare-masked companion picked up the body and the now bodiless head before performing Shunshin no Jutsu to teleport to the Hokage's personal morgue. The tiger-masked man turned his head towards the residence of Naruto, silently wondering just what this organization wanted with the blonde. Undoubtedly, they were after the power of the Kyuubi within him. But they wanted to use Naruto as a conduit of that power, rather than enslave the Kyuubi itself. He had his suspicions about the true nature of the boy, but he kept those thoughts at bay. He was on a strictly need-to-know basis with the Hokage as it was, and it wouldn't help him any to dwell on rumors and hearsay. But the swift motion, he took back off into the night, intent on finding his former senpai and asking him a few questions. Naruto was in danger. And he would need all the help he could get. He had been right. The boy needed the Anbu even more now than ever before. Sasuke barely registered when Naruto jerked his head towards the street at the same time as Kyuubi, both of them sharing a knowing and yet confused look. He barely registered that he was almost hyperventilating. He didn't much care, either. If this was true. No, it was. Naruto had been telling the truth. That scared him. There had been conviction in Naruto's eyes, and the tension coming off of Kyuubi, as well as Naruto himself all but confirmed it. Naruto was an Uchiha. He was related to Naruto. Naruto could, conceivably, activate the Sharingan. Itachi had not gotten them all. He wasn't alone. He had family. He was in the presence of family. He was not alone. Naruto could have the same power he did. Naruto could have the same goal as he did. Was his vengeance meant for more than one person? Was it right to have help, even if it was from a family member? Did Naruto want revenge on Itachi as much as he did? So many questions. Not enough answers. Sasuke. Are you alright? He broke from his musings with a start as he noticed that Naruto was staring concernedly at him from an arm's length away. Sasuke swallowed the lump in his throat and breathed a few times before he nodded hesitantly. It was a lie to think or even say that he was alright. But. Uchiha. Misao. But the start, he remembered that when he had been younger, his mother had spoken of the woman in an almost reverent tone as being her sister, even though they were only really cousins. Apparently, his mother had been rather close to Naruto's mother. If it weren't for the absolute shock he was in, he might have smirked at the irony. If he remembered correctly, his mother had spoken of her as being a brave soul. Or something like that. He had asked her before just what she had meant. But she had just smiled at him sadly and shook her head, remarking that she was simply following her heart, and then she had hugged him and urged him to do the same. He hadn't understood a word of it then, and he still didn't. His father had markedly disliked the woman. He had called her a troublesome influence and bade him not to ask about her, lest he be corrupted. He hadn't understood that, either. Then again, his father hadn't liked hardly anyone. And he had said to not ask about quite a few people, Naruto included. Itachi had remarked once that she was brave. As far as he knew, that was all his estranged older brother had ever mentioned of her. This woman, who was already an enigma in his head, was the mother of his newest friend, second oldest rival, and newfound cousin. This time, he did allow himself a small sad smirk. How far did this rabbit hole go? He was again broken from his musings as he heard Naruto come back into the room from the kitchen, where he had apparently retrieved a bottle of sake. He sat down and poured them both a saucer. And to everyone's surprise, Sasuke had downed his like a shot. Naruto allowed himself a small smile before he refilled Sasuke's saucer once more. Silence reigned in the room for a few minutes before Sasuke got up the nerve to speak. Naruto. You know. This changes everything. Naruto simply nodded and took a sip of his sake. I know. Trust me. I know. I've thought about this quite a bit, actually. I've tried to anticipate what your reaction would be. What my reaction would be. So many different things I've gone through in my head and now, none of them seem to fit the situation. Naruto smiled amusedly. The smile echoed slightly by Sasuke, who noted that Kyuubi was now in her fox form. And was currently enjoying being petted in Naruto's lap. He grinned. It was probably for her benefit as much as Naruto's own stress relief. After a few more moments, Naruto sighed and set down his saucer of sake. Sasuke. Not to sound cold. But. I don't classify family the same way you do. Sasuke looked confused for a moment before he simply schooled himself back into a mask of impassivity, wanting to know where Naruto was going with this. Naruto grimaced for a moment as if reliving a bad memory and then closed his eyes. Sasuke. I've lived almost my entire life without family. I grew up in an orphanage, I had to start living on my own at the age of 7, and I barely had enough money from the orphans fund and Sarutobi's kindness to live off of, let alone have any luxury. Because of this. I don't trust people very much. I don't really even have a concept of family. But I do know one thing. Family, to me, is the people that you care for enough to give up your life for without thinking. To me, the Hokage is family. To me, Iruka-sensei is family. Tucci and Ayamichiraku are family. Aside from them, I don't really count anyone else in that group. Sasuke looked stunned and hurt at the same time, so Naruto decided to continue without pause. You know what family is, Sasuke. You had family until Itachi murdered them in cold blood. So you know what it's like to have people who care for you unconditionally, simply because they're related by blood. You know what it's like to be cared for and protected by people, simply because you were born into the same family as they were. I don't. Please, don't hold that against me. Naruto noticed that Sasuke's expression calmed considerably and an expression of almost pity replaced his previously hurt visage. He scowled. I don't want your pity either. Remember. I grew up alone, so I had to grow up hard. I don't want anyone's pity. He paused for a moment as he collected his thoughts. He sighed. Rather, Sasuke, I want people to acknowledge me for me. I want people to know who Naruto is. I want people to see me on the street and acknowledge my existence, either because they fear me or they love me. I do not care which. However. Those who I consider precious to me, those who I consider family. They have already acknowledged me for simply being me. They do not care about my past. They don't care about the Kyuubi, and they probably don't even care that I'm an uchiha, assuming they know. They only know me by what they've experienced of me. And because of that, I respect them and even love them for giving me a reason to exist. He paused and let that simmer in Sasuke's head for a moment before he continued on to the conclusion. I will readily acknowledge that there is something to being bonded by blood. You and I, we are blood relatives, that much I will not deny. However. If you want to be considered my family. If I want to be considered your family. We have to be sure, to the depths of our being, that we are something to each other that we would die to protect. I have to be sure, to the depth of my being, that you will never betray me, that I can count on you at all times. And you have to be able to do the same with me. In essence, Sasuke. We must support each other with everything we are. We must become brothers. And that takes time. Sasuke wore the same impassive expression he had worn at the beginning of the discussion, but Naruto could feel the emotions radiating off of him in waves. Sadness, regret, happiness, hope. His emotions were obviously a maelstrom of thoughts at the moment and he figured that he would say one more thing and then let Sasuke come to his own conclusion. He smiled, which seemed to reassure Sasuke slightly. Well, it does take time. He smiled even wider and his eyes seemed to regain a bit of luster, causing Sasuke's own face into a smile as well. I'm willing. I'm very much willing to make what effort is needed to become your family. That is, if you think it's worth it to make your own effort to become my family. You're not a bad person once you get past the layers upon layers of emotional protections. Sasuke scowled at this, but he seemed to at least see the point. And I like to think that I'm not a bad person either. If you're willing. Then so am I. We can become family. We can become brothers. It's up to you. Naruto expected another long, drawn-out silence, but what he got was vastly different. Sasuke smiled widely, reminding Naruto of his own foxy grin, and simply nodded. Yeah. I'm willing. Naruto returned the smile in full force. And though it was corny, they both started laughing. Naruto laughed in relief, mirth and even happiness. Sasuke laughed because he now had hope, he now had family, and he now had someone who he would be able to rely on. They both laughed because deep down. They both acknowledged each other. Kyuubi smiled to herself and simply sighed in her fox form. Sometimes, she felt like she was in a damn soap opera. And again, considering Naruto's life. It was to be expected. She settled her head down on Naruto's lap and closed her eyes, enjoying the feeling of levity that had been sorely missed for quite some time. If Naruto was happy, then she would be happy. After all, when the most important person in her life was happy, what was there to be sad about? 3 figures stood in the Hokage's office, 2 of them standing at rapt attention, and the third standing at his favorite vantage point, puffing on his beloved pipe while watching his village's night lights play across the streets. Said figure sighed. This is troubling. Very troubling indeed. If he is after Naruto-kun, then undoubtedly he has other aims in mind. We must be vigilant. The aged Hokage sat down in his chair, resting his forehead in his right hand, as both Kakashi and Tenzo sat down in the 2 chairs in front of his desk. Kakashi was the first to speak. If he really is after Naruto, then perhaps we should postpone the C-rank mission that we asked for until a later date. After this whole debacle has been resolved. Sarutobi shook his head. No. I'm afraid that's not possible. We received word from Kurenai's team that they require assistance in Wave Country. Their C-rank mission has become at least an A-rank mission, with the addition of an A-rank missing nin by the name of Mamachi Zabuza and his apprentice to the equation. Unfortunately, I do not have the manpower necessary to send proper reinforcements. He sighed again, rubbing his temples with his index and middle fingers. That, and we have reason to believe that Hyuga Hinata has been kidnapped by those same missing nin. Your team is going to be dispatched first thing tomorrow morning, along with Mitarashi Anko, to reinforce Kurenai's team and rescue Hinata, as well as finish the original mission. It's simply unavoidable. Kakashi slumped slightly, but nodded his assent. Tenzo rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You could ask Kiashi to send reinforcements with them, Hokage-sama. If Hinata is in danger, then no doubt they would lend assistance. Sarutobi smiled faintly, but shook his head. I fear that Hiashi is currently away on a diplomatic mission to a rather rich village in Suna. In his absence, the Hyuga Council is in charge. And no doubt, they would leap at the chance to depose Hinata as the heir apparent and insert their own. We cannot risk such a political falling out by asking them for assistance, unfortunately. Especially considering that it would probably cause Hinata more harm than good. Tenzo scowled. An expression Kakashi mirrored. Neither had much respect for the Hyuga Council. Or any council, for that matter. And this had just been proven to be justified, yet again. Sarutobi sighed again, taking a long drag from his pipe. After a few moments, he spoke. For now. We wait and see. Tenzo, I expect you and your Anbu to keep a close eye on them and thwart them whenever possible. You have my full permission to use whatever methods you deem necessary. Tenzo nodded and stood, throwing the aging Hokage a salute. The Hokage turned his gaze to Kakashi. Your job remains the same. Safeguard your team and teach them, as you have been doing. In the long run, this means little to you, as you would protect them anyway. Any information you are able to glean about their intentions or membership, however, pass along to us at the earliest possible opportunity. Kakashi too stood and saluted. After a dismissive wave, both poofed out of existence and Sarutobi slumped against his desk, heaving yet another sigh. I'm getting entirely too old for this shit. The shadowed figure puffed on his pipe, looking at the latest report he had gotten from one of his most trusted operatives. He sighed. This did change everything. Anbu was in on this now. As was the old fool Sarutobi. Moreover, the operative that had been sent to spy on the brat had not reported in. Making him believe that Anbu was working much more quickly than he had given them credit for. He smirked. This only lent credence to his theories. If his temporary ally was right. If Naruto really was that boy. He heard 3 knocks to his door before another figure entered, flanked on either side by one of his special Anbu. With a hand motion, the Anbu disappeared, leaving the older figure to sit down at a chair in front of his desk. I was informed that you had important information for us. Speak of it, now. As I loathe to stay here any longer than necessary. The figure blew smoke in the other figure's direction, watching as the newcomer coughed slightly. He smirked. So impatient, you nin from stone are. I thought rocks were supposed to be immovable and eternal. Surely you have time for a little banter before we attend to business. The other figure scowled, though one couldn't see it through the darkness. I did not come here to banter. I came here because you had information. If that is not the case, then I will be taking my leave. He stood for a moment before he was held down forcibly by a newly appeared Anbu, earning a startled gasp from the newcomer. The shadowed figure smirked, but it quickly turned to a scowl. Very well then. If you are so anxious for this information. He stood and made his way to a file cabinet, pulling out a file marked top secret and putting it unceremoniously in front of the other man. The other man looked at it for a moment before he glanced at the figure and shrugged, opening the file and reading the contents. By the end, he was smiling widely and a slightly evil glint shone in his eye. Are you sure this information is accurate? Are you absolutely sure? The shadowed figure puffed on his pipe and motioned dismissively. I do not deal in fake information. That file is completely accurate. I give it to you to do with as you wish. Although, I would advise you that he will be going on a C-ranked mission to Wave Country tomorrow. Perhaps then would be the most opportune time to do whatever it is you wish to do. The other figure smirked. Perhaps, perhaps not. Either way. I am indebted to you. Please, name your price for this debt and you shall have it. The shadowed figure smirked even wider. It is not my debt to collect on. In that file. You found information on a certain exiled Sannin, correct? The other figure nodded and held a confused look on his face. The shadowed figure simply chuckled. Contact him. He will know what to do. I consider this business finished. Please, exit my office and do as I asked. The other figure started slightly at the abruptness of the dismissal before he nodded and bowed slightly, allowing himself to be escorted from the office. The shadowed figure cackled for a few moments before another shadow made itself known in his office. This one holding a much more malicious aura. The shadowed figure scowled. Our deal is ended as well, Orochimaru. You have preparations to make just as much as I do. I suggest you leave. Orochimaru smirked and hissed out a laugh. I was simply making sure that you know I was here, that's all. Your skills haven't dulled, have they, Danzu? Danzu scowled deeper but didn't respond. Orochimaru chuckled and poofed out of existence, causing Danzu to shake his head and sigh. Are you sure that was wise, Taichu? The stone will undoubtedly use quite a large amount of force in their attempt to procure Naruto-kun. He may become useless to your designs. Kabuto stepped out of the shadows, fixing Danzu with an impassive gaze. Danzu simply smirked and waved his hand dismissively once more, taking another puff from his pipe. If he cannot survive an encounter with a few rock nin, then he is already useless to my designs. Think of this as a test. As well as bait. You understand, don't you? Kabuto allowed a sinister smile to reach his lips. Hi, Taichu-sama. Brilliant, as always. Danzu closed his eyes and rested his head on his chair's headrest, relishing the feeling of the tobacco smoke in his lungs. He smiled, something rare for him. You expected any differently? I am the real Hokage of Konohagakure. All of my plans are brilliant and simply serve this village. He took another puff on his pipe. The roots of Konoha are strong, Kabuto-kun. I simply wish to strengthen them. He smiled wider. After all. If the roots are strong. Then the tree is strong. But sometimes, one must destroy the tree and allow the roots to guide it back to rebirth. Thank you for watching this video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to see the next part, don't forget to turn on notifications by hitting that bell icon. Please like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know your thoughts. Check out my other videos for more content you might enjoy. Until next time, take care.